Section 1. The Nuclear Power Plant and What It Did to Springfield. There is a town in America that has never appeared on any map. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for decades, a harbor, a gorge, 2 hospitals, a monorail, and a population of people who have been yellow since birth and never once thought to ask why. The people who live there are kind, mostly. They are curious, occasionally. They are forgetful, consistently. And they have spent the better part of 4 decades living in the shadow of a cracked reactor cooling tower, drinking water from a river where 3-eyed fish swim in lazy circles, and breathing air that has been quietly saturated with something invisible and wrong. The town is Springfield, and tonight we are going to spend a long time there together. This is not a video that asks you to stay awake. This is a video designed to carry you somewhere slow and deep and thoughtful, somewhere you can let the weight of the day dissolve while a very strange story unfolds around you. The theories we are going to explore tonight are genuinely dark, but they are told quietly, carefully, the way you would tell a story to someone who is already half dreaming. So settle in, get comfortable, turn the lights down if you have not already. Because Springfield has been keeping secrets for 36 years, and tonight we are going to find every single one of them. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with the thing that should bother you more than it does. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a background detail. It is not a joke. It is not a piece of set dressing placed behind Homer Simpson's head to establish where he works and nothing more. It is the engine of everything. It is the reason the fish have 3 eyes. It is the reason the people have yellow skin. It is the reason nobody ages. It is the reason the town resets after catastrophic events. It is the reason one man has been alive for over a century, and the reason another man cannot remember his own name despite having a functional brain and decades of life experience. The power plant is the answer. It has always been the answer, and the show has been telling you this so openly, so repeatedly, so unsubtly for 36 seasons that the real mystery is not whether the plant is poisoning Springfield. The real mystery is how the show has managed to tell you this for so long without most people taking it seriously. Let us start with what we know for absolute certain, the kind of canonical facts that the show has established across dozens of episodes and never contradicted. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It provides the primary electrical power for the entire town and surrounding region. And it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most catastrophically unsafe industrial facilities ever depicted in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection of the plant found 342 violations. Think about that number for a moment. Not 3, not 12, not the kind of number that suggests negligence or carelessness or a system that has slipped a little. 342. That is a number that suggests something deliberate. That is a number that suggests someone looked at a list of safety requirements and went through it methodically, one by one, and chose not to implement any of them. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. He is a billionaire many times over. He could have written that check on a Tuesday afternoon and not noticed the change in his bank balance. He refused, not because the money was a hardship, but because spending it would mean acknowledging that the problems existed. And acknowledging the problems would mean someone might start asking questions. Questions about what those violations had already done to the water, to the air, to the people who had spent decades living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers. And the violations themselves are not minor oversights. Radioactive waste was being dumped directly into bodies of water. The same rivers and streams that fed into the town's water supply, the same water that Springfield residents drank every morning without a second thought. Radioactive waste was also being disposed of on children's playgrounds, not in some distant sealed containment site, on the ground where Springfield children played every afternoon after school. Plutonium was being used as a paperweight on a desk, an actual piece of fissile nuclear material sitting casually on a surface in an office where human beings worked every day. The cooling towers, the structures specifically designed to prevent the reactor from overheating and releasing radioactive material, were cracked. And those cracks were patched with chewing gum, not industrial sealant, not emergency repair compounds. Chewing gum, applied by someone who either did not understand what they were dealing with or understood completely and simply did not care. The facility contained luminous rats, not regular rats, which would already be alarming in a nuclear power plant. Rats that glowed. Rats that had absorbed enough radioactive material into their biology that their bodies emitted visible light in the dark. These animals were living inside the walls and floors of an active reactor facility, feeding on whatever they could find, moving through the same spaces where human workers ate their lunches and walked to their workstations. And then there is the detail the show drops most casually of all. The detail it mentions once and never returns to. Skeletons in the basement. Human skeletons in the basement of a working nuclear power plant. The show shows you the bones and moves on. Nobody in Springfield investigates. Nobody in the episode asks who those people were or how they ended up dead inside a reactor facility that is supposedly a place of employment, a place people come and go from every day. The skeletons are just there. A detail dropped into the background of a scene, visible for a moment, and then gone. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this, the man whose literal job is to stand between the plant's violations and the people of Springfield, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, who the show's own creator has stated, has an IQ of 55. Homer Simpson, who we later learn has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically blocking his neural pathways and reducing his cognitive function to something that medical professionals would classify as a disability. Homer Simpson, who sleeps at his workstation, who eats donuts during meltdown warnings, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a piece of food into the reactor core out of curiosity about whether it would grow larger. That is the person standing between the population of Springfield and a radioactive catastrophe. He has been standing there, failing at that job, for over 3 decades. Now here is where the theory begins to develop real weight. The very first visible mutation in Springfield appears in Season 2. Blinky, a fish, caught in the river near the power plant, with 3 eyes. Not 2 eyes, the standard biological configuration for fish that has existed for hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution. 3 eyes. A 3rd eye growing from the center of the fish's forehead, clearly visible, unmistakably wrong. Blinky becomes national news within the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses the fish as evidence that Burns is poisoning Springfield's environment. Burns is forced to appear on live television and eat the fish to demonstrate that it is harmless. He sits at the table. He takes a bite. He chews. The show cuts away before you can see his reaction, which is a deliberate choice. The town watches Burns eat the fish and then moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up water quality study. Nobody tests the river. Nobody dispatches biologists to examine more specimens. Nobody asks the obvious question that hangs in the air like smoke. If the fish have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people who are drinking the same water those fish live in? The answer has been visible since Season 8. In the episode called The Springfield Files, Homer encounters something in the woods at night, a glowing figure. A creature that moves strangely, that seems barely human, that radiates an eerie light from somewhere inside its body. Homer reports what he has seen. The town panics. FBI agents are called in to investigate. The episode builds slowly toward its revelation, and when the truth comes out, the creature is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns, we learn, undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with experimental chemicals and controlled radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow for hours afterward. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he would be dead before the following weekend. The regimen is so extreme that after each session, Burns wanders out of the facility in a dazed, euphoric state, stumbling through the woods near Springfield in the early morning hours like something that is not quite human. He literally glows in the dark. Not metaphorically, Burns is so saturated with radiation-based medical intervention that his body emits visible light, and the people of Springfield see this glowing figure in the forest, and their first instinct is to conclude that it must be an alien from another planet. Not radiation. Not the power plant that has dominated their skyline for decades. An alien from outer space. That is the depth of Springfield's collective denial. The Simpsons movie takes the radiation evidence and makes it impossible to ignore. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so extreme that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency operating within the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the surrounding region. The dome is enormous. It covers the entire town, and the EPA does not remove the residents first. The people of Springfield are inside the dome when it goes down. Think about what that means within the logic of the show. The federal government of the United States looked at Springfield and concluded that the town was so toxic, so fundamentally contaminated, so dangerous to the surrounding environment, that the only viable solution was containment, not cleanup. Containment. The kind of response you would apply to something that could not be fixed, only isolated. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard zone by the United States government. And every resident who has been drinking that water and breathing that air and living downwind of those cooling towers for decades is still inside the dome when it goes up. Now look at the residents themselves. Look at them carefully and slowly, the way you might examine something you have been looking at for years without truly seeing it. Homer Simpson, massive overbite, bulging eyes that protrude from his skull in a configuration that does not occur in normal human anatomy. 4 fingers on each hand. A skull shape that defies standard biological architecture, an IQ that places him in the range of clinical cognitive disability, and a body that can absorb physical punishment that would kill an ordinary person many times over. He has been shot, he has been electrocuted, he has fallen from cliffs, he has been struck by cars, he has survived explosions. He walks away from every single one of these events, sometimes with minor injuries, sometimes with no apparent damage at all. His healing rate is not human. His pain tolerance is not human. His capacity for physical survival is not human. And he has spent his entire adult life working in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor core. Marge Simpson. The same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers, hair that grows straight up in a tower that defies the laws of physics and gravity, maintaining its exact shape without product or structure for 36 years. Marge was briefly employed at the nuclear power plant. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking radiation. And all 3 of her children were born after both parents had already spent years in Springfield's contaminated environment. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. All born in Springfield, all raised in Springfield, all drinking the same water and breathing the same air, and living under the shadow of those cracked cooling towers every single day of their lives. And every one of them displays physical characteristics that do not occur in normal human populations. The spiky hair that maintains its shape without any product. The overbites, the bulging eyes, the yellow skin. The yellow skin. Every resident of Springfield has yellow skin, not 1 or 2, every resident. The entire population of a town shares a physical characteristic that does not occur naturally in any human population anywhere on Earth. And here is the detail that makes the entire theory click into place. When visitors come to Springfield from outside, they look different. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit at more realistic positions in their faces. Their features more closely resemble the actual anatomy of human beings. The show draws outsiders with a noticeably different visual register than it draws Springfield residents. And the explanation that most people accept without question is that this is just the art style. That is just how The Simpsons looks. But within the internal logic of the show's own universe, within the rules of the world the show has built and maintained for 36 years, there is a visible and observable difference between people who live in Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look, by comparison, normal. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. The same proportions that deviate from real canine anatomy. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. Springfield's wildlife is demonstrably altered by the power plant's runoff. The show tells you this directly. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and labels it clearly as evidence of what the radiation is doing to living organisms. And then it expects you to believe that the same radiation has had no effect whatsoever on the humans living in that same environment, drinking that same water, eating fish caught from that same river. Now, let us talk about Burns, because Burns is where the conspiracy becomes visible. Burns knows. He has always known. The show makes this explicit not through a single dramatic reveal but through the quiet accumulation of detail across dozens of episodes. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians who are not affiliated with any Springfield medical institution. He undergoes weekly treatments that, as we have already established, are so intensive that they cause his body to emit visible radiation. Burns understands what radiation does to biological systems in a way that no one else in Springfield does, because he is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body. He is not just profiting from radiation. He requires it to survive. And he knows what his plant is doing to Springfield. He has always known. When German investors briefly purchased the power plant and attempted to bring it up to code, the first thing they did was fire Homer Simpson. The second thing they did was assess the cost of implementing the safety repairs that the facility required, and the estimate nearly bankrupted them. The cost of doing the right thing was so enormous that the people who came in with genuine intentions of running the plant responsibly could not afford to do it. Burns bought the plant back immediately, and he rehired Homer immediately. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within a week. Homer ensures that the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated, and Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and, by extension, its entire population. A population that may be, after decades of radiation exposure, too cognitively compromised to fully understand what is happening to them. The crayon in Homer's brain is the show's most devastating piece of evidence for this reading. In Season 12, the crayon that has been lodged in Homer's brain since childhood is surgically removed. His IQ does not rise by a moderate amount. It rises dramatically into what the show depicts as genius territory. Homer becomes intelligent, articulate, and capable of processing the world around him with a clarity he has never experienced before. And it makes him miserable. He sees Springfield for what it truly is. He sees his job for what it truly is. He sees his life with a clarity that his previously compromised cognition had mercifully blurred. And the experience is so painful, the reality of his situation is so unbearable when viewed through a functional mind, that Homer chooses to have the crayon put back. He chooses stupidity. He chooses the fog. He chooses not to see. But here is the question the show never asks. The question that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain in the first place without any adult noticing? Homer went through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving medical checkups from Springfield-based physicians. Not one of them found a foreign object in his skull. Not a single medical professional in decades of treatment ever identified a crayon sitting in Homer Simpson's brain. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any rational explanation, or someone knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. And if Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the medical establishment of the town he essentially owns is quietly looking the other way, while radiation does what radiation does to his workforce, then Homer's crayon stops being an accident and starts being something more deliberate. The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. The characters do not age because their biology has been altered at a cellular level in ways that interfere with normal aging processes. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's cognitive function is compromised in ways that affect long-term memory retention. Homer survives injuries that should be fatal because decades of radiation exposure have changed what his body can endure. Burns stays alive because he has the resources to manage his own radiation exposure with treatments that no one else in Springfield can access. And nobody in Springfield questions any of this because the same environmental contamination that mutated their bodies also affected the neural architecture responsible for critical thinking and pattern recognition. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. Springfield is a contamination zone with a sitcom playing on the surface. The residents are not eccentric. They are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that powers their homes, that employs their neighbors, that poisons their water and irradiates their children, and keeps their billionaire employer alive through mechanisms none of them understand, is not a background gag. It is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery from a fatal injury, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every unexplained detail that the show introduces and then never revisits. It all leads back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply, feeding into the same compromised biology that cannot quite figure out why the fish have 3 eyes, and the children have yellow skin, and the old man who runs everything seems to have been alive since before the automobile was invented. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not just part of the show. It is the show. And nobody in Springfield will ever understand that, because the plant already made sure they could not Hey, before we move on, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. And if you are finding this relaxing, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it genuinely means everything. Now, let us go deeper. Section 2. Homer's Coma Theory. The Dream That Never Ended. Now that you understand what the radiation is doing to Springfield, we need to consider a different possibility. A possibility that does not contradict what we have just established but instead wraps around it, encompasses it, reframes it entirely. What if the radiation theory is correct, but only inside the mind of a man who has not been conscious since 1993? Settle into that for a moment. Let it sit. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple enough. Bart, in the spirit of April Fool's Day, plays a series of escalating pranks on Homer. Each prank is worse than the last. The final prank involves Bart taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can is shaken until the pressure inside it is extreme, almost violent. Then it is placed back among Homer's regular beers in the refrigerator and left for Homer to find. When Homer opens the can, the resulting explosion is powerful enough to send him to the hospital. This is already a darker setup than the show usually uses. But what happens next is darker still. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, still recovering from the explosion, he spots a vending machine on the other side of the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for it. The machine tips over. It lands on top of him, and Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma. A genuine coma. Not a cutaway joke, not a dream sequence played for laughs. Homer's heart stops and he becomes clinically unconscious. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart tearfully confesses at his bedside that the whole prank was his fault, and Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Homer laughs. Everything returns to its usual configuration. The show tells you he woke up. The show presents his recovery as a given, the natural end of a story arc, the resolution of a crisis that has now passed. But in the final moments of that same episode, there is a detail. A small, quiet, easily overlooked detail. Homer is told that during his time in the coma, he lost 5% of his brain function. 5%? Gone permanently? Never coming back. The doctors deliver this information. Homer responds by laughing. He tells his family that he does not know why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. 5% of a human brain is not a trivial amount to lose, and the way Homer responds to losing it, laughing without understanding why, unable to process the significance of the information he has just received, is not the response of a man who has woken up fully and recovered completely. It is the response of a man who is still somewhere else. This is the Homer coma theory. The single most debated, most elaborated, most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. Originally proposed by a Reddit user, the basic premise is this. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every escalating absurdity, every impossible event, is a dream being generated by the comatose mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits. The evidence for this theory is not one thing. It is the accumulation of many things, assembled carefully over the 32 years of television that followed that April night. Let us start with the most obvious piece of evidence, the one that is hardest to dismiss once you see it. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a different kind of show. Not different in animation or voice or character design, different in scope, different in what it chose to be about. The early seasons dealt with recognizable human problems told through the lens of satire, but grounded in the kind of situations that real families experience. Homer tries to quit drinking and struggles with the social and emotional dimensions of addiction. Marge considers whether she is satisfied with her life and her marriage. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has to navigate the complex feelings that come with intellectual admiration and romantic longing. Bart struggles with his grades, faces the possibility of being held back a year, and has to reckon with the consequences of his own choices. These are domestic stories. They are small, in the way that the best domestic stories are small, contained, specific, human. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle, it is seismic, and it happens quickly. Homer goes to space, not in a dream sequence, not in a fantasy. Homer Simpson, safety inspector at a nuclear power plant, is selected to travel to space as an astronaut and goes on an actual space mission. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante justice group. Homer joins a secret society with ancient rituals and enormous power. Homer discovers that his mother is alive and has been living as a radical fugitive for decades. Homer meets God, twice. The show goes from a family sitcom rooted in economic anxiety and domestic tension to something where the main character has traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs, befriended scores of celebrities, survived every form of physical trauma imaginable, and met multiple sitting presidents. The escalation is so pronounced, the tonal shift so dramatic, that it has been the subject of debate for more than 20 years. Fans have argued endlessly about when The Simpsons lost its grounding, when the writing changed, when the show stopped feeling real in the way that the best early episodes felt real. The coma theory has a precise answer. The Simpsons did not get worse. Homer's brain got worse. The episodes did not become more absurd because the writers stopped caring about plausibility. They became more absurd because the mind generating them was losing coherence, losing the ability to distinguish between what was possible and what was not, losing the structural architecture that keeps a dreaming brain tethered to recognizable reality. And here is the moment the theory becomes something that stays with you long after you have finished reading about it. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. An actual face-to-face conversation. Homer skips church and spends the day doing whatever he wants, and in the freedom of that afternoon, God appears to him. And during their conversation, God tells Homer something. He tells him that he will one day learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God tells Homer that his time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline lines up with a precision that is either the most remarkable coincidence in the show's history or something the writers placed deliberately, knowing that some portion of the audience would eventually find it. God told Homer his time was nearly up, and 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended. What the show presents as a quirky theological joke, a warm and funny moment of divine interaction, reads under the coma theory as something else entirely. It reads as a prophecy, as God gently, kindly, in the way that God apparently speaks to Homer Simpson, letting him know that the waking world was almost done with him. And everything that came after was the dream of a man who heard that and did not quite understand what it meant. The aging problem. This is the piece of evidence that the coma theory explains more elegantly than any other framework in existence. More elegantly than the radiation theory. More elegantly than cartoon logic. More elegantly than any production-based explanation about the conventions of long-running animated series. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle between them. Every theory that attempts to explain this agelessness has to work hard to make its case. The radiation theory proposes that the mutation has altered their biology at the cellular level. The cartoon logic explanation simply points to how animated shows work. But the coma theory has the simplest, most emotionally direct answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never woke up. Of course, his children do not age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to see it happen. He never watched Bart turn 11. He never watched Lisa get her first pair of reading glasses. He never watched Maggie take her first real steps without falling. His mind has no reference material for those events. It cannot render them because it does not know what they look like. His wife does not age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly as she does in every episode. His friends do not change because his memory of them is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell and the world went dark. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost it. Because that is what the unconscious mind does when it dreams. It does not generate a consistent forward-moving timeline. It circles. It returns. It shows you the same faces in the same places with the same feelings attached to them. And it does not notice that time should be passing because inside the dream, time is not what it is on the outside. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons make a different kind of sense under this theory too. Homer's comatose brain is receiving input from outside. Sound from the television in his hospital room. fragments of conversation from visitors and nurses, music from the radio, names, faces, cultural references, filtering through the fog of unconsciousness and being processed by a dreaming brain that is doing its best to make use of them. That is why later seasons are dense with famous names and recognizable faces. It is not that Springfield became a magnet for celebrities. It is that Homer's brain is absorbing fragments of external media and weaving them into the dream. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through the walls of unconsciousness, translated into a character by a mind trying to keep the simulation running. The show itself has acknowledged this theory in a way that is either a definitive denial or a very sophisticated wink, depending on how you interpret what they did. In season 34, the episode Lisa the Boy Scout includes a deliberately leaked, fake deleted scene. In this scene, Homer wakes up from a long coma. He looks around, confused, disoriented, clearly not quite himself. And the scene suggests that every outlandish episode, every impossible event, every piece of escalating absurdity in the show's 30-year run was the product of a dream. The show's writers created this scene. They animated it, voiced it, produced it to a complete and professional standard. And then they revealed that it was a hoax, a fake deleted scene planted online to confuse and delight fans. But they made it. They spent money and time creating a scene in which Homer explicitly wakes up from a coma and everything is revealed to have been a dream. And then they said it was a joke. The fact that they made it at all tells you something about how seriously the show's creative team has engaged with this theory. They know about it. They have thought about it. They found it compelling enough to spend production resources depicting it, even if only to deny it afterward. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory publicly in 2015. He dismissed it. He said it was not true. He said Homer was not in a coma. He encouraged fans to move on. But Al Jean did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift that happens precisely around season 4. He did not explain why the show becomes progressively more detached from recognizable reality with each passing year, which is exactly what you would predict if the theory were correct and the dreaming brain generating the episodes were slowly deteriorating. He simply said it was not true and the conversation moved elsewhere. But the fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever done. It makes the show make sense. All of it. Every piece of evidence, every anomaly, every impossibility, arranged under a single elegant framework. The reset button that erases consequences between episodes. The fact that Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body is in a hospital bed, and only his mind is in Springfield. The celebrity flood of the later seasons, the ageless children, the tonal shift, the increasingly surreal plots, all of it is consistent with a dreaming brain losing coherence over decades of unconsciousness. And here is the part that is hardest to think about. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is the most heartbreaking thing on television. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind reconstructs every single episode, is not adventure. It is not fame or money or excitement or any of the things the show gives him. It is his family. That is the center of the dream. Marge, still loving him. Bart, still his mischievous little boy. Lisa, still playing her saxophone in her room. Maggie, still small enough to hold. Friday night at the Simpson house, forever. In the coma, the dream gives him exactly that. His family preserved in amber, his children never growing old, his wife never leaving, his life never ending. The same couch, the same television, the same beer, the same love, repeating on a loop that never concludes. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever ask for. And every time he survives something impossible, every time the credits roll and the world resets, every time something that should end the story does not end it, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let go, refusing to stop generating the one thing that makes whatever is happening to his body bearable. His family. If the story ends, if the dream stops, if the simulation finally runs out of energy and collapses, then Homer would have to wake up. And waking up would mean finding out how much time has passed, how old his children really are now, whether Marge has moved on, whether anyone is still sitting beside that hospital bed in Springfield General after all these years. Or it would mean not waking up at all. That is the coma theory. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April 1993. Every episode since then is a love letter from a man who cannot move or speak or open his eyes, addressed to the family he cannot reach. The show will never confirm this, but it will not disprove it either, because the evidence is not something you can argue away. It is structural. It is baked into the architecture of 32 years of television. Nobody ages, reality keeps getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in his dream, he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The case that was never actually closed. We know the official answer. Season 7, Episode 1. Who shot Mr. Burns? Part 2. Maggie did it? Baby Maggie Simpson. Case closed. The show confirmed it. The writers stand behind it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled canon. Except, the case was never really closed. And the more you examine the evidence, not the evidence the show points you toward, but the actual canonical facts established across both episodes, the more it becomes clear that the official answer might be the most elaborate cover-up in the history of Springfield. Let us go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. Summer 1995. The Simpsons attempted something that had never been tried by an animated series before. A genuine mystery. A properly constructed whodunit designed with enough care and detail that the show's creators actually invited viewers to participate in a national contest. Submit your guess. The winner would be animated into a future episode. Fox promoted it as a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the fictional shooting as a real unsolved case. The show was not just television that summer, it was a national puzzle. And to understand why the solution to that puzzle is still contested, you need to understand what Burns did to deserve being shot. He stole an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary. Not purchased it, stole it through a legal technicality, gutting the school's budget and eliminating the programs that the students depended on. He shut down Moe's Tavern by orchestrating the financial ruin of its owner. He created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing every elderly resident, including Grandpa Simpson. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a way the show depicts as cruel and unnecessary. And for his finale, Burns constructed a massive mechanical disc and used it to block out the sun above the entire town. Not symbolically, literally. He built a device that prevented sunlight from reaching Springfield, plunging the town into permanent artificial night, so that every resident would have no choice but to buy their electricity from his power plant. He stole the sun from an entire community because he wanted more money. When Smithers protested this plan, Burns fired him immediately. By the end of the first part, every single person in Springfield had a genuine, substantial, well-documented reason to want Burns dead. The episode took its time establishing individual motives for a remarkable number of characters. Homer, because Burns had spent years unable to remember his name despite Homer working for him his entire adult life, a daily humiliation that had finally reached a breaking point. Bart and Lisa, because the oil theft had destroyed their school's funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home had been demolished. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job when the school lost its money. Tito Puente, because the music program that gave his career its Springfield foothold was eliminated. Moe, because his bar was gone. Even Smithers, freshly fired, spiraling into alcoholism, betrayed by the man he had devoted his life to. The entire town gathered at a public meeting. The tension was so high that multiple characters were visibly armed. And then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound. He staggered to the town's sundial and fell. His hands landed apparently on two specific letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's own perspective, M and S. The ambulance took him. The screen went black, and America waited through an entire summer to find out who pulled the trigger. Here is what the show told us when September came. The investigation plays out as a comedic procedural. Smithers confesses immediately, but his confession collapses because he was blackout drunk at the time of the shooting, and it emerges that the person he actually shot was old Jasper, in the leg, a completely separate incident in a completely different location. Smithers did not shoot Burns. Suspects are eliminated one by one. Principal Skinner has an alibi. Moe has an alibi. Tito Puente has what the show presents as the greatest alibi in the history of television, a complete musical number explaining in elaborate detail that he channeled his rage into composing a samba rather than committing violence. The investigation stalls until police find an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis places the eyelash as belonging to a member of the Simpson family. Homer's fingerprints are found on the gun. He had the clearest single motive of anyone in town. He is arrested and comes close to being convicted. Then Burns wakes up from his coma and identifies his attacker. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he encountered her in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. In the resulting struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun went off. Burns was shot. Mystery solved. Or so the show insists. Let us start with the contest, because the contest is where the official answer begins to crack. Fox invited viewers to submit their guesses for who shot Burns. The prize was significant, the opportunity to be animated into the show. Thousands of entries came in from across the country. And according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, nobody from the randomly selected sample of entries guessed the correct answer. Not one person. The person who was awarded the prize was chosen from the pool at random, and because they did not have the right answer, they received a cash payment instead of the animated appearance. The show's own writers acknowledged on the commentary that they were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup online on the very night of the original broadcast. But this person was using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest ended. They could not find the one person who got it right. Think about what that actually means. The show's creators designed a mystery, told the public it was solvable from the clues presented in the first episode, organized a national contest around it, and when the answer was revealed, essentially no one in the entire viewing audience had correctly identified the solution. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were so effective that they overwhelmed the legitimate evidence, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence the way the show claimed it did. Now look at the clues themselves. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands appear to land on W and S, or from his perspective M and S. The show presents this as pointing to Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself stated, canonically and explicitly, that the position of his hands on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately arrange himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell. He landed where he landed. The central piece of evidence in the show's own solution, the detail that the episode uses to justify identifying Maggie as the shooter, was explicitly described by the victim himself as a coincidence. Then there is the gun. Burns carried a personal firearm in a holster. Shortly before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. The gun was not in it. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who had not brought a weapon to the town meeting. Someone who did not plan to shoot anyone. Someone who encountered the gun by chance and used it impulsively, opportunistically, in a moment of anger or accident. A baby finding a dropped gun on the ground fits this profile. So does roughly a dozen other characters who were not armed that evening. Burns's last words before being shot were, "Oh, it's you." Not surprise, not alarm. Recognition. The tone in which you would acknowledge someone familiar, someone you have met before, someone you do not consider a threat. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show does not establish a meaningful prior relationship between Burns and Maggie before this event. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has worked for him for years, shown up at his home, interacted with him in dozens of contexts. The idea that Burns would see a one-year-old baby and respond with calm, familiar recognition, as though greeting an acquaintance, does not track with everything the show has established about how Burns relates to people. Then there is Season 18. Homer simply states, in a scene that plays as almost throwaway, that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it, on camera, without any setup or elaborate context. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield is told by one of his own employees that he confessed to the attempted murder of Burns years earlier, and the show treats it as though Homer said something inconsequential about the weather. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is entirely within his character, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it because he is the one who actually pulled that trigger. And if Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A baby was named as the perpetrator of a crime she did not commit. And the evidence that supposedly proved her guilt, the DNA, the sundial, the testimony of a man who had just woken up from a coma with a bullet wound and impaired judgment, was either manufactured, misinterpreted, or accepted without adequate scrutiny because the conclusion it pointed toward was convenient. Chief Wiggum himself says it. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect fall guy. An infant who could not deny the accusation, who could not understand what she was being accused of, who could not be prosecuted regardless of what the evidence said. If someone in Springfield wanted to protect the real shooter, blaming Maggie was the cleanest possible resolution. The Marge theory deserves careful attention here. A Reddit-sourced alternate reading argues that Marge was the real shooter, and the case for it is more substantial than you might initially expect. Marge had been watching Burns systematically dismantle everything her family depended on. He had stolen her children's school, he had injured her dog, he had blocked out the sun above her home. She had every reason in the world to want Burns gone. And Burns, in an earlier episode, had developed an infatuation with Marge. He had fallen for her in the way that men like Burns fall for people, possessively, obsessively, and with no real understanding of what the other person actually wants. If Burns saw Marge in that parking lot, if she was the person he said, "Oh, it's you," to, a woman he was infatuated with, someone he would not immediately perceive as a threat, someone whose presence might have confused and disarmed him, then the "it's you" makes a different kind of sense. Not the recognition of a familiar face, the recognition of someone he had particular feelings about. And if Burns protected her, if he woke up from his coma and looked around the hospital room and saw his staff and saw the police and decided that naming the woman he had feelings for was something he would not do, then he looked at the sundial near his bed and let the town draw its own conclusions from the letters his hands had fallen near. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was the safest possible answer. The alternate Smithers ending was fully produced. A complete, voiced, animated conclusion in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter was created and shown in a clip show, where Troy McClure dismisses it by noting that it would have required ignoring the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, as he puts it, downright nutty. The line is a deliberate reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury did in fact choose to disregard DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is winking. It is telling you that juries ignore DNA evidence, that official verdicts are not the same as truth, that the people in power get to decide which answer becomes official, and that the official answer and the true answer are not always the same thing. Early drafts of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter, a direction the writers considered seriously enough to plan out an entire prison storyline around before abandoning it. The mystery was reverse engineered. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose, not the other way around. The answer was never determined by the evidence. The evidence was selected to support the answer, which means the entire national contest was built on a foundation that was never quite solid. And in the final shot of Part 2, after everyone else has left the hospital room and Maggie is alone, she looks around carefully, making sure she is not observed. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics the action of pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie knows what she did. But a baby who watched someone else shoot Burns and then found herself in the center of an investigation and then heard the word shooter applied to herself enough times that the action became associated with her identity, that baby might do exactly the same thing. She might mime what she saw happen, what she was told she did, because mimicry is how babies process experience. Maggie is not confessing, she is remembering, or repeating, or both. And the distinction between those three things is something the show never quite resolves. The case is officially closed, the show committed to Maggie. The writers have said so many times, but the contest nobody won. The clues that the victim himself said were meaningless. The alternate endings that were professionally produced and then disavowed. Homer's unaddressed confession in Season 18. The Marge theory that fits the known facts with uncomfortable precision. All of it suggests that the greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are two very different things. Section 4. How Mr. Burns has stayed alive for over a century. This is not a rhetorical question. It is not a setup for a joke about cartoon immortality. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, within the rules of the fictional universe the show has built and maintained across 36 years, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. And understanding how he has managed to survive for as long as he has reveals something deeply strange about the relationship between wealth, power, radiation, and death in Springfield. His age is the starting point. The show has been inconsistent about Burns's exact age, which is itself part of the mystery. But every version of his timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century, speaking about them the way you would speak about things you experienced yourself rather than things you read about in history books. He has told stories about events from the 1910s and 1920s as first-hand accounts. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's viewing audience was born. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale decades before any of the other characters' parents were alive. He served in World War II, in a capacity the show describes as morally complicated at best. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the show's own continuity, he may be considerably older than that. And he does not just exist. He functions at a high level. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal and state politics with a fluency that suggests long experience and deep knowledge. He orchestrates complex schemes that require long-term planning, sustained cognitive effort, and a working understanding of modern law, modern finance, and the relationships between institutions that take decades to properly understand. His body is frail, yes. His physical strength is minimal. But his mind is sharp in a way that is genuinely impressive. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a ruthlessness and precision that nobody else in the show can approach. And he has been doing it for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. The Springfield Files episode, as we discussed in the context of the radiation theory, is the most explicit canonical statement about how Burns stays alive. The weekly medical treatment so intensive that it causes his body to emit visible light, keeping him alive for exactly 7 more days before he requires another dose. But the implications of that revelation go much further than the episode itself explores. Burns is not surviving through anything resembling natural biological processes. He is being kept alive artificially through a recurring medical intervention administered on a precise weekly schedule. Miss one treatment, not because the treatment is interrupted, but simply because the appointment is not kept, and Burns dies. The margin for error is 0. His life is maintained the way you maintain a piece of complex machinery, through scheduled servicing, through regular application of something that compensates for what his body can no longer do on its own. And the substance of that treatment involves radiation. Think about what that means. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. Burns is not just profiting from radiation, he is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material, by his own early exposure and then by his deliberate medical protocol, that it cannot sustain itself through normal cellular processes anymore. He requires external radiation input the way a normal human body requires food and water and air. Take it away and the systems begin to fail within days. This explains something that the show has depicted many times but never directly addressed. Burns's immune system, or rather what functions in its place. In one of the series' most famous scenes, Burns visits a doctor who delivers an extraordinary piece of medical news. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one of them, simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains that all of these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium, each illness counterbalancing every other illness. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, drawing an analogy to 3 people trying to pass through a single doorway at the same moment. None of them can move because they are all blocking each other. Burns's diseases are all present in his body, all attempting to kill him, all progressing simultaneously. But because they are all progressing simultaneously, they create a biological gridlock in which no single illness can gain enough advantage over the others to become dominant and actually end his life. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is the sickest man in the United States, and the sickest man in the United States is functionally indestructible because the very things that should kill him are, collectively, preventing each other from doing so. This is played for laughs. It is one of the show's most quoted moments. But if you accept the radiation theory as a framework for understanding Springfield, the Three Stooges syndrome makes a different kind of sense. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The treatments do not cure his diseases. They cannot cure them. There are too many of them, and they are too deeply embedded in his biology at this point. What the treatments do is manage them. They keep every illness in precisely calibrated stasis, balanced against every other illness, a constant adjustment of the internal chemistry that prevents any single condition from breaking the equilibrium and gaining dominance. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatment schedule is the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. Too much of one thing, and the balance collapses. Too little of another, and the gridlock fails. The treatments keep the system in a perpetual, artificial, carefully managed, steady state that allows Burns to continue functioning despite carrying a biological burden that should have ended him a century ago. Smithers' role in all of this deserves more attention than the show gives it. The show presents the Smithers-Burns relationship primarily as a story of devotion, loyalty, and unrequited love. Smithers serves Burns with a dedication that goes far beyond the professional obligations of even the most committed assistant. He manages Burns's schedule, his correspondence, his personal affairs, his physical comfort, his social interactions. He monitors Burns's condition with a vigilance that borders on medical oversight. And the show has established clearly, through multiple episodes, that if Smithers were ever removed from his position, Burns would be helpless. Physically helpless. Not emotionally lost without his loyal companion, though perhaps that too. But physically unable to maintain the protocol that keeps him alive. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, without Smithers ensuring that the weekly appointments are kept, and the doses are administered correctly and the timing is precise, Burns would miss a treatment. And missing a treatment means the disease equilibrium begins to collapse. And when the equilibrium collapses, every illness in Burns's body surges forward simultaneously. Smithers is not just devoted to Burns out of personal feeling. He is devoted because he understands on some level that his absence is a death sentence. The relationship that looks on the surface like loyalty and love has an additional dimension that neither character ever explicitly acknowledges. Smithers keeps Burns alive through logistical competence, and both of them know it. Now let us go further back into Burns's history. The show has depicted Burns in a remarkable number of historical contexts. He has described personal involvement in events spanning from the early 1900s through the present day. He knew figures who are now historical footnotes. He attended institutions that existed before the First World War. He served in military roles during the 1940s, roles the show depicts as having been shaped by whatever moral compromises Burns was already making at the time. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during World War II and kept it hidden for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history that he has studied, but as a period he experienced personally, as someone who was alive and active and engaged with the world during those years. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it across various episodes, extends back centuries. They were not just wealthy in the modern sense. They were the kind of wealthy that shapes the political and physical landscape of nations. The kind of wealthy that builds the infrastructure everyone else uses and then charges the people who depend on it for the privilege. The kind of wealthy that exists so far above the mechanisms of legal accountability that accountability becomes theoretical. And the Burns family has maintained this level of wealth and influence across multiple generations in a continuity that the show implies has lasted longer than most American institutions have existed. Which raises a question the show never answers. Is Burns unique? Or has his family always found ways to extend their biological survival beyond the natural human lifespan? Before nuclear medicine, before the specific treatment protocol that currently keeps Burns alive, the Burns family was still maintaining its grip on its accumulated power for generation after generation. The continuity of their influence suggests either extraordinarily good luck in producing capable successors or something more deliberate. Some mechanism by which the family's key figures extended their effective lifespans long enough to accumulate the kind of deep, layered, institutional power that the current Burns possesses. The show does not answer this. But it does establish that the Burns family line has been in effective, continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through ordinary generational succession. It requires something else. Something the show leaves implied rather than stated. And then there is Burns's relationship with death itself. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the series, and through means that are far more concrete than Homer's cartoon logic survivals. He has been shot. He has been hospitalized numerous times from various causes. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been stranded in the wilderness. He has faced death with a frequency that seems almost improbable for a man in his physical condition, and every single time he comes back. Not because the show simply decides not to kill him, the way it decides not to kill Homer. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of extreme wealth that has been constructed over the course of more than a century, specifically to ensure that his survival is not subject to the same variables that govern everyone else's mortality. When Burns is shot, he has the best medical care that money can buy, doctors who understand his unusual biology, who know about the treatment protocol, who know what his body needs and are equipped to provide it even in the middle of a medical crisis. When Burns collapses, someone is always close enough to get him to a facility equipped to manage his condition. When Burns is in danger, there is always someone whose entire professional existence is organized around ensuring he is not in danger for long. Homer's immortality is passive. He survives because the show needs him to survive, and his body absorbs whatever the plot delivers. Burns's immortality is engineered. Every dollar he has ever spent on private medicine, every institution he has ever corrupted to ensure favorable treatment, every politician he has ever purchased to keep regulatory scrutiny away from his facilities, every doctor he has ever retained under confidentiality agreements, every piece of infrastructure he has ever built to ensure his own comfort and security. All of it serves, in the final analysis, a single purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, his empire begins to fracture. And empires, particularly the kind that have survived this long, are not designed to allow that. The most unsettling part of the Burns immortality reading is not that he might live forever. It is that Springfield needs him to. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's ownership and management. Burns depends on his weekly treatments. The treatments depend on the medical infrastructure that only Burns's wealth can maintain. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system where the man, the machine, and the money feed each other in a cycle that has no natural termination point. Springfield cannot kill Burns, because Springfield cannot function without Burns. And Burns cannot die, because dying would mean the system he has built over a century finally has to answer for everything it has done to the people living inside it. Burns is not immortal. He is something more disturbing than immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper. Springfield's Architecture of Denial. On the 28th of September, 1997, The Simpsons aired an episode that the fan base has been arguing about for almost 3 decades. Not arguing about whether it was good or bad, though that argument has also been going on for almost 3 decades, and the consensus is not generous. Arguing about what it means, what it reveals, what it says about Springfield that the show would not otherwise say directly. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper, Season 9, Episode 2. The backlash when it aired was immediate and intense. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner among many other characters, publicly stated his displeasure. Critics argued that the episode destroyed one of the show's most carefully built secondary characters by revealing that everything known about him was built on a fiction. Fans who had invested in the show's continuity felt genuinely betrayed. The episode is still consistently cited as a low point, the moment the show stopped respecting its own history. But what if that reading has it exactly backwards? What if The Principal and the Pauper did not break The Simpsons? What if it told the truth about what The Simpsons had always been, in a way that the show was usually too comfortable to say directly? Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event celebrating Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. The ceremony is underway, the community has gathered, and a stranger walks in. A man nobody recognizes introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. He is a Vietnam veteran who was captured during the war, held as a prisoner, presumed dead by everyone who knew him, and who has only now, decades later, managed to make his way back to the town where he was raised. He is, he explains, the real Seymour Skinner. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a petty criminal, a young man from a troubled background with no clear future. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and was present when Skinner was captured and believed killed. When the war ended, Tamzarian traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Agnes, Skinner's mother. But when he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed someone to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never in his life experienced anything resembling a stable family or a real identity worth keeping, let her believe it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the position, the relationships, the entire identity. He lived inside that borrowed life for 20 years. Until the real Skinner walked through the door. Now everything is exposed. The real Seymour Skinner stands in Springfield. Armin Tamzarian stands in Springfield. The truth is not implied or suspected. It is documented, confirmed, witnessed by the entire community. And the town holds a meeting to decide what to do about it. What Springfield does in that meeting is, depending on your perspective, either the funniest or the most terrifying thing the show has ever depicted. They vote, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for identity fraud, not on how to restore the real Skinner's life and name and position. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. And the verdict is unanimous. They choose the lie. Judge Snyder issues a formal legal decree stating that Armin Tamzarian is the real Seymour Skinner, that the man who was born Seymour Skinner is legally nobody, and that it is forbidden, under penalty of torture, to ever speak the truth again. The actual Seymour Skinner, the decorated veteran who survived imprisonment and came home to find his life occupied by a stranger, is physically tied to a railroad car and expelled from Springfield. He is sent away. He is removed. The truth is placed on a train and shipped out of town so that the comfortable lie can continue undisturbed. And then the show continues, as though none of this happened, which is the most important detail of all. Fans hated this episode. They felt it violated the integrity of a character who had been built up carefully over many years. They felt it invalidated everything that had been established about Skinner's backstory, his mother, his relationship with Bart, his Vietnam-era history. But here is the thing that the fans' disappointment was pointing at without quite articulating. The episode is perfectly, brutally honest about what Springfield is. It just says the quiet part out loud. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed collectively to forget whatever does not fit the version of reality it prefers. Every catastrophe that has ever befallen Springfield has been forgotten by the following episode. Every revelation that should have changed the town permanently has been absorbed and then quietly discarded. Every truth that should have been impossible to ignore has been, somehow, ignored. The Principal and the Pauper is the only time the show ever showed you the mechanism behind all of that forgetting. Usually the reset happens off-screen. The dome comes down. Springfield's collective amnesia is just presented as a fact of the show's reality, something you are expected to accept because it is convenient for storytelling purposes. This episode showed you the vote. It showed you the actual moment when a community chooses to maintain a fiction rather than confront the truth. It showed you the legal process by which that choice is formalized and enforced. It showed you what happens to the person who carries the truth when the community no longer wants to hear it. And then, as if to prove that the mechanism works, the show moved on and the vote was never mentioned again. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should permanently alter its reality. The town has been physically destroyed and rebuilt more than once. It has been invaded. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has survived nuclear near misses, biological threats, environmental disasters of genuinely catastrophic scale. It has encountered extraterrestrial visitors. It has had its sun blocked out. It has had its entire social order disrupted by revelations that, in any functioning society, would trigger cascading consequences that would take years to fully work through. And every single time by the following episode, everything is back to normal. Nobody references what happened before. Nobody draws connections between the current situation and the previous crisis. The slate is clean. The loop has reset. Fans call this episodic storytelling. The radiation theory calls it cognitive damage. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain cycling between sleep cycles and losing the thread between them. But the Principal and the Pauper offers a different explanation, one that is both more and less reassuring than any of the others. Springfield resets because Springfield chooses to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says we will not acknowledge what happened, we will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, We will treat the fiction as truth and the truth as criminal, and anyone who violates this contract will be removed. This is not a cartoon trope. This is how communities actually function. Small towns, insular communities, close-knit groups of people who depend on each other and who cannot afford to let certain truths surface have a documented and terrifying capacity for collective denial. Scandals are buried not because nobody knows about them, but because everybody tacitly agrees not to surface them. Crimes are forgotten not because the evidence disappeared, but because the community decided the social cost of pursuing the truth was higher than the social cost of living with the lie. Uncomfortable realities are rewritten, slowly, collectively, until the official version is the only version anyone remembers. Springfield does not forget because its residents are cognitively impaired, though the radiation theory suggests that may also be true. Springfield forgets because the community has decided, over and over, that remembering is too dangerous. If they remembered the dome, they would have to acknowledge the pollution. If they acknowledged the pollution, they would have to confront the power plant. If they confronted the power plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economy that depends on his facility would collapse. If the economy collapsed, the town would not survive in its current form. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make forgetting legally mandatory. They exile the people who cannot forget. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most honest man. He showed up with proof that the official narrative was a lie, with the credibility of someone who had lived through the events in question, with a name and a history that belonged to him and had been taken without his knowledge or consent. And Springfield's response was to tie him to a train. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. Now read this through the lens of the coma theory. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then the Tamsarian episode takes on a dimension that the show would never deliberately build into its text, but that fits with uncomfortable precision. Homer's unconscious mind in this reading invented a scenario where an entire community votes to sustain a lie because Homer needs to believe that lies can be maintained indefinitely through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real through the agreement of the people around you. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can replace the true version, and nobody will ever successfully challenge it. Because that is what Homer's coma is. A fake life replacing the real one. A dream that has lasted so long it has taken on the texture of reality. A fiction that everyone in Springfield has agreed to maintain, because maintaining it is better than facing what happens when it ends. And as long as the dream town of Springfield keeps voting to sustain the fiction, as long as the social contract holds, Homer never has to wake up. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the most structurally important one. It is the only episode that shows you, explicitly and in real time, the machinery that makes every reset possible. The mechanism behind the collective forgetting. The social infrastructure that allows a town full of people with yellow skin and 4 fingers and mutated fish in their rivers to look at all of that and say, yes, but everything is fine. Armin Tamsarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is somewhere out there, on a train that left town years ago, carrying a truth that nobody wanted. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the most powerful person in Springfield. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates through pacifier noises and pointed looks and the occasional gesture that could mean almost anything if you are not watching carefully. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She is the smallest person on Evergreen Terrace and, by weight of evidence, the most capable. She shot a billionaire. She led a daycare rebellion against an authoritarian caretaker. She has saved her family from life-threatening situations on multiple occasions. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed those of adults many times her age. She has been formally tested and found to possess intelligence that defies what standardized measures can even express. And through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has maintained her silence. Absolute, deliberate, unbroken silence. Not because she cannot speak, because she chooses not to. Let us start with the shooting. Because it is the event most people associate with Maggie, and also, as we discussed earlier, probably the least interesting thing about her. Whether or not Maggie actually pulled the trigger on Burns, whether the official answer is correct or whether the evidence points to someone else entirely, the aftermath tells you something significant about how Springfield relates to this particular infant. A baby was identified as the person who shot the richest man in town. The police investigated. The evidence was examined. The conclusion was reached, and it was, yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a powerful adult, and there is absolutely nothing to be done about it. Chief Wiggum delivers the line with comedic timing but genuine logical clarity. No jury in the world would convict a baby. And then, when everyone has left the hospital room, when Maggie is alone, she does something that the show presents as ambiguous, but that is far more specific than it appears. She looks around the room, slowly, deliberately. She checks that nobody is watching, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. That sequence requires three things that infants do not typically possess. It requires situational awareness, the ability to assess whether she is being observed and adjust her behavior accordingly. It requires memory, the ability to recall the specific action being mimicked and reproduce it accurately. And it requires caution, the understanding that performing this particular gesture in front of other people would have consequences that performing it alone would not. Those are not infant behaviors. Those are the behaviors of someone who understands what they have done, understands that it had significance, and understands that concealment is the appropriate strategy. Now look at The Longest Daycare. This is a short film, 7 minutes long, released in 2012 and nominated for an Academy Award. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare center run with authoritarian efficiency. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar about to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby, a bully named Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film. Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's security systems to protect the caterpillar and eventually release it into the world outside. She does all of this without speaking a single word. She does it through observation. She assesses the environment when she enters, cataloging threats and resources with a thoroughness that would be impressive in an adult. She identifies the key variables: Gerald's aggression, the staff's patterns of movement and attention, the layout of the facility, the location of the caterpillar, the location of the exits. She develops strategies on the fly, adapting when plans fail, finding alternative approaches, improvising in ways that require spatial reasoning, predictive modeling of other people's behavior, and a capacity for sustained, multi-step planning. Her body is the obstacle. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when she needs to run. Her motor development cannot keep pace with her cognitive development, but her decision-making throughout the short is essentially flawless. Every choice is the right choice. Every move is optimized for the goal. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical form cannot fully support. And she succeeds anyway because intelligence compensates for what the body cannot yet do. The show has tested Maggie directly across various episodes. The results are inconsistent in their specific numbers because the show does not maintain precise continuity on this point, but the pattern they reveal is not inconsistent at all. Maggie consistently registers as extraordinarily intelligent. Off charts, beyond what the measurement tools being used can accurately assess. The show plays each of these moments for a quick laugh and moves on, but the accumulation of them forms something that cannot be dismissed as a running gag. And then there is the silence. Maggie's first word was "Daddy." It was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, in a cameo performance that was treated as a significant cultural event. It happened once. It was never repeated. Maggie has gone 36 years in Showtime without developing language in any meaningful or sustained way. She exists in a household of extremely verbal people. Homer narrates his own experience at high volume. Marge processes everything through conversation. Bart provokes and taunts and argues at every opportunity. Lisa lectures, debates, soliloquizes, fills every room she is in with ideas presented at length and with great passion. The Simpson household is a constant, overwhelming wall of noise, and in the middle of it, Maggie sits in silence, watching, listening, processing. The theory is that Maggie's silence is not a developmental delay. It is a strategic choice made by a mind intelligent enough to recognize the value of not being noticed. And the case for that reading is built from what Maggie has observed about the family she lives inside. Look at what happens to intelligent women in the Simpson household. Lisa Simpson is brilliant, genuinely, measurably, demonstrably brilliant. She has an IQ that exceeds everyone in her immediate family by a significant margin, and most of the adults in Springfield by an even wider one. She is principled and articulate and creatively accomplished. She plays the saxophone with genuine skill. She writes and advocates and argues and challenges. She brings a level of intellectual engagement to her existence that should, in any functional world, be recognized and nurtured. What has it gotten her? Isolation, mockery, dismissal, the experience of being the smartest person in almost every room she enters and being treated, in those rooms, as inconvenient and irritating rather than valuable. Lisa speaks and is ignored. Lisa challenges authority and is punished. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and runs into the resistance of a community that does not want to be improved and is made uncomfortable by the reminder that improvement is possible. Lisa's intelligence is her most defining characteristic and the source of her most consistent suffering. And Maggie has been watching this happen. She has watched since birth, which in Springfield means for 36 years, as her sister fights every single day for recognition and receives nothing but resistance. She has watched the most intellectually capable person in the family be consistently and systematically overlooked, devalued, and dismissed by a household and community that rewards compliance and punishes insight. And Maggie drew a conclusion from what she observed. Not the conclusion Lisa drew, which is to keep fighting regardless of the cost because the truth matters and visibility matters, and someone has to be willing to be the person who insists on both. Maggie drew the opposite conclusion. Silence is armor. Invisibility is power. The less they notice you, the more you can actually accomplish. Every single time Maggie does something extraordinary in the show, what happens? The family does not notice. The community does not notice. Burns was shot and the investigation focused on every adult in Springfield before circling back to the infant, because who suspects the baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded in part because nobody monitors infants closely enough to see them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of remarkable cognition, every moment where Maggie solves a problem or saves someone, it happens in the spaces where nobody is paying attention. And Maggie has ensured that nobody pays attention to her by maintaining the most effective possible disguise. She pretends to be exactly what everyone expects a one-year-old baby to be. Quiet, passive, dependent, unknowing. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. She is the most cognitively capable member of the Simpson family, and she has spent 3 decades making certain that nobody figures that out. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates biological mutations, and if those mutations express differently in different individuals depending on some combination of genetics, exposure timing, and other variables the show does not specify, then Maggie may represent the far end of a spectrum that has Homer at the other. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to the point of clinical impairment. The radiation, in combination with the physical brain damage from the crayon and the decades of additional exposure from working at the plant, took something from his mind that was never fully replaced. Maggie's mutation may have done the opposite. The same environmental cause, the same family genetics, the same contaminated water and irradiated air, but expressing in a way that amplified rather than diminished. Where Homer's brain was diminished, Maggie's was enhanced to a degree that testing cannot accurately capture. Homer and Maggie as two sides of the same radioactive coin. He is what happens when the mutation removes. She is what happens when the mutation adds something extraordinary. And if the coma theory frames everything, Maggie's genius in the dream becomes something else entirely. If Homer is unconscious in a hospital bed, if every episode is generated by a dreaming mind, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are not the product of mutation. They are the product of paternal love projected onto a child he cannot see, cannot hold, cannot watch grow up. He cannot know what Maggie is becoming. He cannot watch her learn to walk or talk or become herself. So, in the dream, he makes her already everything he hopes she will be. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age, a competence that transcends her body, a capability for survival and problem-solving that means she will be okay even without him there to protect her. Her genius is not a mutation. In this reading, it is a father's prayer, the specific content of what a man in a coma desperately needs to believe about his youngest child. But back in Springfield, in whatever version of Springfield is real, there is another reading, a darker one. Maggie does not speak because speaking gets you nothing in this particular town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is punished in Springfield. She watches everything, remembers everything, understands everything, and she waits. For what? The show never tells us. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. She is the only character whose future remains completely unknown because the show has never definitively revealed what she is building toward. We have seen glimpses. We have seen her demonstrate capabilities far beyond her apparent development. We have seen her confirm or deny assessments of situations with a single look. We have seen the family defer to her judgment implicitly in moments of crisis, without quite knowing why. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot speak beyond isolated sounds. And she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She just has not decided what to do with that yet. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about her. Not what she has done, which is already remarkable. What she has not yet done. What she is accumulating, silently, behind that pacifier and those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate invisibility. Something is thinking in there. Something is planning. Something is watching the family and the town and the systems of power and the structures of denial that hold Springfield in its particular shape. Watching and waiting and saying nothing. And when Maggie finally decides to act, when she finally breaks her silence in whatever form that takes, nobody in Springfield will see it coming. Nobody was meant to. Section 7. The Simpsons predictions: how a cartoon shaped reality. Let us talk about the predictions. You have probably seen them. Screenshots, clips, posts, videos, all presenting variations of the same premise. The Simpsons predicted it. Whatever the current news event is, whatever technology has just emerged, whatever political outcome has just occurred, someone somewhere has found a Simpsons episode from years or decades ago that depicted something strikingly similar, and the image has gone viral, and the question has been asked again. How are they doing this? Let us work through this carefully, because the full answer is more interesting than either the conspiracy version or the dismissive debunking version. Start with the cases that are hard to argue with. In the year 2000, the episode Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson becomes the first female president of the United States. In that episode, Lisa's predecessor in office is identified as Donald Trump, depicted as someone whose presidency left the country in such financial and institutional disarray that Lisa inherits a catastrophic mess. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 presidential election. The internet response when this was noticed, or rather re-noticed, since it had been observed before but suddenly became impossible to ignore, was extraordinary. Screenshots spread everywhere. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in years suddenly had opinions about it. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted it" became part of the cultural vernacular, a shorthand for a specific kind of eerie prescience that people were not sure how to categorize. There are others. A 1995 episode depicted a device being worn on the wrist that functions remarkably like a modern smartwatch, years before the technology existed in any consumer form. A 1998 episode featured Homer discovering a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that an actual mathematician later identified as predicting a value consistent with the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. A 1999 episode has Homer proposing a theory about the universe being shaped like a donut, and years later, cosmologists examining certain radiation patterns found evidence that the universe's topology might indeed be toroidal. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating from Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic search for treatment. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19, and during that fictional outbreak, the townsfolk accidentally release a swarm of what the show calls killer bees, which felt distinctly strange to anyone watching in 2020 when Asian giant hornets, quickly dubbed murder hornets by media outlets, appeared in North America during the actual pandemic. In 1996, an episode contained a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra while in an impaired state. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years separated the joke from the reality. In 1998, the show depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox. That acquisition happened in 2019. Across multiple episodes throughout the series, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect, domestic surveillance tools, and various forms of connected technology years or decades before those things became everyday features of life. Now, how? The official answer, from the people who actually make the show, is blunt and unsexy. Al Jean, executive producer, has put it simply: when you throw enough darts, you will eventually hit bullseyes. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations, jokes, and extrapolations about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that span of time, some of it is going to align with future events through pure statistical probability. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, was even more direct. There are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted anything, he has said. Mostly it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history tends to repeat itself. Fact-checking organizations that have examined specific claims have generally supported this reading. Many of the most viral prediction examples turn out to be less precise than the screenshots suggest, or to be based on trends that were already clearly visible when the episodes were written. And that last point is the key. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency. They observed that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for office since the late 1980s, that he had built a brand around his name and his money and his outspokenness, and they wrote a joke about the logical extreme of celebrity politics. They did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. They observed that media consolidation was an accelerating structural trend in the entertainment industry and wrote a gag about the logical endpoint of that process. They did not predict smartwatches. They observed that technology was consistently getting smaller and more personal, and imagined what wrist-mounted computation might look like. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in television. Multiple writers hold advanced degrees from institutions including Harvard and Yale. Many have serious backgrounds in mathematics, science, economics, and political theory. These are people who spend their careers studying how systems and trends actually work and then extrapolating those trends to their absurd but logical conclusions. They are not guessing, they are reading. And they are reading more carefully, with more analytical rigor than most people who are not paid to do it full-time. But here is where the debunking is not quite the whole story. Because some of the coincidences are specific in ways that statistical probability has a harder time accounting for. The Trump episode did not simply depict a celebrity president. It named Trump specifically and showed him descending a moving staircase in a sequence that visually mirrors the actual announcement he made in 2015, decades after the episode aired. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not simply joke about exotic animal acts being dangerous in a general way. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is almost exactly what happened when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers in 2003. These are not vague trend extrapolations. These are specific details that align with specific future events in ways that make you pause. So, what is the correct framework for understanding this phenomenon? Neither the supernatural explanation nor the pure coincidence explanation quite fits all the evidence. There is something else going on. Something that the show's own creators do not fully acknowledge because it is stranger and more interesting than "we're good at satire." The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future by normalizing it. The show is one of the most watched, most quoted, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. Its jokes have entered the cultural bloodstream. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand themselves and their world. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke does not exist in isolation. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people mention at dinner parties and share online and think of when Trump's name appears in the news. And that cultural processing, that repeated exposure to the idea framed as an inevitable absurdity, changes the audience's relationship to the possibility. The idea stops feeling like a shocking aberration and starts feeling like an obvious punchline. And punchlines, when they arrive, feel like recognition rather than surprise. The show did not predict Disney buying Fox. The show made media consolidation feel like an obviously inevitable outcome by depicting it as something so unsurprising it could be treated as satire. When it actually happened, the cultural response was not primarily shock. It was the specific feeling of something finally catching up to what everyone somehow already knew was coming. The Simpsons satire does not forecast the future. It primes the cultural imagination for futures that are already in motion. It takes trends that are in early or intermediate stages and presents them as accomplished facts. And when those facts materialize, the audience experiences a recognition that feels like prophecy but is actually the result of having been prepared for the outcome years in advance. Springfield is not a reflection of America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and the audience stared into it long enough to start resembling what they saw. The corrupt billionaire with his hand on the power supply. The incompetent safety infrastructure. The population too busy with the texture of daily life to fully reckon with the large systems that shape their existence. The endless cycle of crisis and reset. The collective amnesia that allows the same structural failures to repeat because confronting them would require changing more than any individual is willing to change. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first and made it funny. And here is the final piece that completes the picture. The Simpsons has also made predictions that did not come true. Thousands of them. Jetpacks, moon colonies, technologies and cultural shifts and political outcomes that never materialized. Political satire that pointed in directions history did not take. Episodes that depicted futures that remain purely fictional. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds viral posts around the predictions that failed. Nobody asks how The Simpsons knew something would not happen. The process by which the show's content becomes culturally meaningful is a filtering process. The hits are remembered and amplified. The misses are forgotten. Confirmation bias does not operate neutrally. It finds what it is looking for and presents it as representative. When you filter nearly 800 episodes of satirical content about American culture through a confirmation bias engine as powerful as the internet, selecting only the moments where the content aligns with reality, you end up with a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the natural result of a brilliantly written show running for an impossibly long time, staffed by highly educated observers of American culture, producing more content than any comparable show in television history, and having that content filtered by the most powerful selection mechanism for confirming patterns that has ever existed. The Simpsons did not predict the future. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to come true. And the ones that came true are the only ones anyone remembers. But try explaining that to yourself the next time a clip from 1,997 lines up perfectly with a headline from 2025. Because even understanding exactly how the trick works, knowing the mechanics from the inside out, it is still somehow striking to see it happen. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations, and enough bullseyes scattered through the wreckage to make even the show's own creators wonder, occasionally, if they know something they should not. Section 8. Mona Simpson, the conspiracy that broke 3 generations. There is a woman who explains everything about Homer Simpson. Not Marge, the other one, the one who was not there. Mona Simpson is the most important character in the history of the show who barely appears in it. And the story of her disappearance, her exile, and the specific man who engineered both is a conspiracy that reaches from Homer's childhood all the way to his daily life as an adult, connecting his brain damage to his job, to his emotional architecture, to his employer, in a chain of cause and effect that the show implies. But Homer himself is too damaged to fully trace. For the first 6 seasons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson told Homer that his mother had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, in the way that Homer mourns things, imperfectly and incompletely, carrying the loss in a way that shaped his personality without ever being fully processed or resolved. Homer grew up believing he was a boy whose mother chose to die rather than raise him. That belief, whether he articulated it that way or not, became the foundation of his emotional life. His desperate need for acceptance, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive desire to be liked by the people around him, even people who treat him badly, his willingness to endure humiliation and dismissal and being ignored at his own workplace rather than risk the loss of the stability he has worked his whole life to build. Homer Simpson's personality is, at its core, a coping mechanism for a lie about maternal abandonment. Season 7. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995, and it is regarded by a significant portion of the show's fanbase as one of the greatest episodes in the series. This is the episode where Homer discovers that his mother is alive. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It was, the show reveals with characteristic specificity, the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been pointing his grieving son toward a famous writer's headstone for Homer's entire childhood. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery. She is visiting what she believes is her son's grave, mourning the child she has not seen in decades. When Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that the show plays without a single joke, without a single cutaway, without the usual rhythm of comedy that the show uses to soften emotional moments. A man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had no choice. Because the alternative was putting Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who owned the nuclear power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for without ever making the connection, had destroyed her life and forced her to disappear. It goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe, they had a young son named Homer, and she was living an ordinary life in Springfield while the larger world was going through convulsions. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture, the protest movements. And then something changed in Mona. The show depicts it with a kind of gentle absurdity but genuine emotional weight. She was radicalized. She joined a group of activists who were targeting a specific facility, a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that expand for a moment. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. He owned a germ warfare research facility, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons. In Springfield, the same town where the power plant would later be built. The same town where children played and families lived without any knowledge of what was being developed down the road. Burns was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in the same community where Homer Simpson was growing up. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid succeeded. The biological weapons were destroyed. But Mona made one mistake. As the group fled the facility, she stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos of their exit. She stopped to help them up, and the person she stopped to help was Burns. She helped Burns to his feet. He saw her face, he identified her, he called the FBI, and from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not call. She could not write. She could not explain to her young son what had happened or why she was gone, or that the absence was not a choice she was making about him personally. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping. She walked out of the house in the early morning hours, and she disappeared for 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she had died, and Homer spent the next 3 decades believing, on some level that he probably never articulated clearly even to himself, that there was something wrong with him, something that made the people who should love him most leave. Now here is where the conspiracy takes on its full shape. Burns did not just call the FBI and then let the matter rest. He pursued Mona, actively, persistently, across decades. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in season 7, Burns recognizes her through a cab window almost immediately. He has not forgotten her face after more than 25 years. He contacts the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother a second time, now understanding what the first goodbye cost them both. And he knows who forced her out. He knows that the man responsible for his mother's exile, for his childhood without her, for 27 years of believing she was dead, is his own employer. Homer works for Burns. He has worked for Burns his entire adult life. He earns his living from the man who destroyed his family. And the show is honest about what Homer does with this information. Not much. He does not quit. He does not confront Burns in any sustained or meaningful way. He does not even seem to fully process the connection between the billionaire who signs his checks and the billionaire who stole his mother when Homer was 6 years old. This is not played as comedy. It is played as the natural consequence of cognitive damage that has been accumulating since Homer's childhood. Homer is too impaired to make the connection that would free him. His brain does not work in a way that allows him to trace the architecture of his own suffering. And this, perhaps, is the most deliberately cruel element of the whole system. The man who broke Homer also created the conditions that prevent Homer from understanding that he was broken, or who broke him, or what could theoretically be done about it. Burns did not just take Homer's mother, he engineered Homer's entire adult existence. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in specific ways. Desperate for approval from authority figures, incapable of sustained defiance, terrified of abandonment, willing to endure almost any treatment from his employer, rather than risk the loss of the one stable structure his life has. Burns created, in Homer Simpson, the perfect worker for a facility that should have been shut down decades ago. A man who would not ask questions, who would not file complaints, who would not notice things that a more psychologically secure person might notice and feel obligated to act on. Homer does not work at the power plant because he is too unintelligent to find better employment. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child, and the broken version of Homer is precisely what the power plant requires. The show confirms this conspiracy through a later revelation. It emerges that Burns and Grandpa Simpson struck a deal. Burns had committed some crime that Grandpa discovered. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant. No matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how many documented errors accumulated, no matter how many times he should, by any rational standard, have been let go. 742 documented errors, the show has mentioned at various points. And Homer was never permanently terminated because the deal between his father and his mother's persecutor, struck in secret and never explained, protected him. Homer's job security was not a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation brokered in exchange for silence about whatever Burns had done. Two men, one of them the most powerful person in Springfield and one of them a powerless old man who discovered something he was not supposed to know, made an agreement that shaped Homer's entire adult life without Homer ever being told about it. 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's grudge and the deal-making that followed it. Mona fought against Burns's biological weapons program and lost her family. Abe made a deal with the man who destroyed his wife and buried the truth to protect his son. Homer inherited the consequences of both choices without understanding either of them, growing up emotionally damaged, cognitively impaired, working for the man who caused all of it, too deeply shaped by the system to ever fully see the system for what it is. And Burns won. Burns always wins in Springfield, because Burns is the one who sets the terms. Burns is the one who bought the politicians, who employs the safety inspector, who pursues the radicals, who strikes the deals, who owns the infrastructure that everyone else depends on. The show proved what Homer could have been in the episode where the crayon is removed. Homer is brilliant without it. He is articulate and analytically capable and aware of the world around him in a way that he has never been with the crayon in place. The man Homer could have been, the man he would have been if Burns had not intervened when Homer was 6 years old, if Mona had been allowed to stay, if the system had not been so precisely engineered to produce a specific kind of damaged compliance in the person it needed in Sector 7G. That man exists somewhere inside Homer's skull, trapped behind a crayon and decades of radiation, and the emotional architecture of a child who woke up one morning and found that his mother was gone. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Her death is one of the quietest, most unadorned moments the show has ever produced. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches her go. No joke softens it. No cutaway interrupts it. Just a man and his mother, and the weight of all the years that were taken from them, pressing down on both of them as she leaves for the last time. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, underneath the gags and the slapstick and the 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up, there is a story about a family that was systematically damaged by one man's power and one town's failure to resist it. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the enemy and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and never understood why his life felt heavier than it should. And Burns won, because in Springfield, the man with the money and the willingness to do whatever the money enables him to do will always win. That is the system. Burns did not create it. He just understood it earlier and more completely than anyone else in town. And he has been using that understanding, for over a century, to make sure the system continues to serve him. Homer will work at the power plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal. Because his mother made a choice. Because Burns needed a broken man in Sector 7G, and Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 9. Where is Springfield, the geography that refuses to exist? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can identify Springfield than can name the capital of half the actual states in the country. It has a nuclear power plant, a gorge, a tire fire, a harbor, a monorail, a butte, 2 hospitals, a prison, an elementary school, and a quickie mart. It is somewhere in America, and that somewhere has been the subject of one of the longest-running debates in the history of fan culture. But the real question is not which state it is in. The real question is why the show has spent 36 years constructing an elaborate and internally consistent geography that cannot possibly exist anywhere on Earth, and what that impossibility is doing in the story. Springfield borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching. It is on the coast. It is also in the heartland. It is near the Canadian border. It is also reasonably close to Mexico. It has mountains within driving distance. It also has beaches within driving distance. It experiences blizzards and tropical heat waves and everything between them within a single season. It has a desert nearby. It has a rainforest nearby. It has an active volcano. No real town in America, no real town anywhere on Earth, has all of these geographic features within practical distance. Springfield does not exist in any one state because Springfield exists in all of them simultaneously. The show has been deliberately contradicting itself about Springfield's location since the beginning. Every time an episode appears to narrow the possibilities, another episode from a different season contradicts it. In one episode, Springfield is unambiguously in the north. In another, it is clearly in the south. Lisa's area code begins with 636, which is a Missouri prefix. The state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which does not correspond to any actual state. The voice on the other end of the line when Homer calls the state capital once identifies the state as one that begins with a vowel, which narrows the field slightly without actually resolving anything. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed this directly in a 2012 interview. He said he named the town Springfield after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up nearby. He chose the name because it is one of the most common city names in America, found in dozens of states, meaning the name itself resists being pinned down. For approximately 48 hours, it seemed like the mystery was solved. Springfield, Oregon. And then the show continued producing episodes that placed Springfield in contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's statement. They kept the contradiction alive. Because the contradiction was always the point. The official explanation is the one the show's creators have given openly and which is clearly true on its own terms. Springfield is designed to be universal. It is every American town simultaneously. The geographic impossibility is intentional. It is designed to make Springfield feel familiar to every viewer, regardless of where they actually live, to make the show's commentary about American life feel applicable to the specific place the viewer is watching from, wherever that is. This is a real and intentional design philosophy. The show's creators have confirmed it, and it works. Springfield does feel like a place you could be from, wherever you are actually from. But through the lens of the theories we have been exploring, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on additional dimensions. If the radiation theory is correct, if the power plant has genuinely altered the biological and perhaps physical environment of Springfield, why should geography be exempt? The show has established that the contamination affects living organisms in ways that defy normal biology. Humans with 4 fingers and yellow skin, fish with extra eyes, animals with physiologies that do not match their species' standard anatomical templates. If the radiation can alter biology this dramatically, is it unreasonable to suggest that it has also done something to the physical landscape? That it has compressed or distorted or reshaped geographic features in ways that should not be possible? That the reason Springfield has mountains and oceans and deserts all in proximity is that the town exists in a space where the normal rules of physical geography have been bent by the same force that bent the rules of biology? If the coma theory is the framework, Springfield's geography makes immediate intuitive sense. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise, internally consistent map of America. It has impressions, fragments, emotional associations with places he has visited or seen or imagined. Mountains from a family vacation. Oceans from a commercial on television. deserts from a movie he half-watched, the flat expanse of the Midwest from a long drive. These fragments are not organized into a coherent geographic system because dreams do not work that way. Dreams have emotional logic rather than geographic logic. They assemble the significant pieces of a person's landscape memory and arrange them according to feeling rather than map coordinates. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and incomplete and held together by longing and familiarity rather than cartographic accuracy. And through the principle and the pauper theory, the theory of Springfield's collective denial, the town's geographic ambiguity serves a specific protective function. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot file federal charges against a nuclear power plant if its state of operation changes between episodes. You cannot hold anyone accountable for environmental violations if the regulatory jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. You cannot send an inspector from the relevant state agency if you cannot establish with certainty which state agency has jurisdiction. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone shows up with official credentials and a clear mandate and starts asking questions about the fish with 3 eyes and the cracked cooling towers and the man running the facility who has apparently been alive since the Spanish-American War. The town that cannot be located cannot be governed by the rules that govern located towns. There is also the matter of the show's 12th season, the mockumentary episode Behind the Laughter, which explicitly states the Simpson family's home state as Northern Kentucky in its original broadcast, and then, in syndicated reruns of that same episode, changed the location to a different state entirely. The answer was given, and then the answer was changed. Even when Springfield has a definitive location, that location is not definitive. It shifts, it mutates, it refuses to stay fixed, just like everything else in this town. Every state in the country has been proposed as Springfield's home state at some point. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence undermining it. The show has built this ambiguity so thoroughly into its own architecture that resolving it would require overriding 36 years of deliberate contradiction. Springfield will never be conclusively located, not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that the question is more valuable unanswered. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone, and a town that belongs to everyone cannot be shut down, cannot be contained, cannot be held to standards that apply in one place but not another. Springfield's geography is its last defense. Section 10. The floating timeline: why nobody ages and what it really means. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December 1989. He is 10 years old right now. He will be 10 years old in whatever year you are watching this. Lisa was 8. She is still 8. Maggie was 1. She is still 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They remain in their mid-30s. 36 years have passed in the world outside Springfield. 0 years have passed inside it. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The show's present is always the viewer's present. When the episode airs, the characters are living in the year the episode airs. The technology around them reflects that year. The cultural references reflect that year. The characters respond to whatever is happening in the world in that year, but the characters themselves do not change. They do not age. They do not carry the accumulated weight of the years that have passed. Most people accept this without much examination because it is the convention of long-running animated series, and the convention has been normalized over decades of television viewing. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has produced contradictions too large to simply wave away. The show's own structure is beginning to buckle under the weight of what the timeline requires. The most visible example is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was rooted in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. Their courtship was set against the specific cultural backdrop of that era: the music, the fashion, the politics, the texture of American suburban life in that particular moment. This made complete sense for two people who were in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. But the floating timeline dragged the present forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they cannot have met in 1980. They must have met approximately 45 years later. Their high school experience cannot have been defined by Watergate and disco. It must have been defined by smartphones and social media. The show has accommodated this, haltingly, across multiple flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's origin story has been retold at least 4 times, each version placing their formative years in a progressively later decade. They have been depicted as children of the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. They were counterculture adjacent, then grunge era, then hipster, then indeterminate millennial. The love story is always the same. The context keeps changing. What this means, within the internal logic of Springfield's reality, is that Homer and Marge do not have a stable past. Their history is not a fixed thing. It is a document that gets rewritten every few years to maintain the illusion that the present is still the present. Their memories are not stable. Their origin story is a draft that keeps being revised, and the previous draft is not preserved. It is simply replaced. Now apply the theories. Every single theory we have explored arrives at this point. They take different routes and use different logic and emphasize different evidence, but every one of them arrives at the same conclusion about the floating timeline. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man who went to sleep in 1993 and never woke up. Of course, his children do not age. His mind cannot age them because it does not know what they would look like older. His wife does not age because he has no reference for what she would look like with 30 years more on her face. The floating timeline, in this reading, is not a production choice. It is the structural limitation of a dreaming brain that can only render what it already knows. The radiation theory says nobody ages because decades of exposure to the specific kind of radiation leaking from the Springfield nuclear power plant have altered cellular aging processes in ways that conventional biology cannot predict. The mutation that gives the residents yellow skin and 4 fingers and bulging eyes has also, somewhere in the cascade of biological effects, interfered with the mechanisms that normally drive aging. The characters are not frozen in time. They are frozen in biology. The timeline floats because the biology that should anchor it to the passage of years has been altered beyond its normal function. The principle and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield collectively agrees not to acknowledge the passage of time, for the same reason Springfield agrees not to acknowledge anything that would be inconvenient to acknowledge. If the residents of Springfield aged normally, if Bart turned 11 and Lisa turned 9, and Homer's hair went gray, the show would be forced to deal with consequences, with growth, with change, with the natural progression of events that produces irreversible outcomes. Springfield's social contract prevents this. The town votes, implicitly and continuously, to maintain the fiction that time is not passing. And the Burns immortality theory adds one more layer. At least one person in Springfield has clearly found a way to negotiate with time through the application of extreme wealth and experimental medical technology. If Burns can live for over a century, the concept of aging in Springfield is already demonstrably negotiable. Time does not work for Burns the way it works for everyone else. And if Burns has bent the rules of biological time for himself, the question of what else the plant's runoff has done to the surrounding population's relationship to time becomes genuinely open. All 4 theories converge. Time is broken in Springfield, not metaphorically, not as a narrative convention that the audience is expected to simply accept. Within the logic of Springfield's own reality, something has happened to the normal flow of time for everyone who lives there. The show has imagined its characters aging multiple times and in enough detail to prove it can do it. The most celebrated example is the season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, which flashes forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married to a British man she met at university. The future the episode depicts is detailed and specific and emotionally rich. Lisa has grown into someone recognizable from the Lisa we know, but shaped by the decades that have passed. Intelligent, principled, lonely in the specific way that very capable people who have always felt a little out of place tend to be lonely, searching for connection in a way that feels earned and human. The episode is beautiful. It is proof that the show is capable of telling a story about these characters growing up, about what they become, about the shape of their lives if time were allowed to move through them. And at the end of the episode, it vanishes. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future is sealed away. The flash forward is filed as a what if, and the permanent present resumes as though the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine growth. It declines to permit it. And this choice, the choice to imagine and then rescind, to show and then take away, is the floating timeline's most honest moment. It reveals that the decision to freeze the characters is not a passive default but an active refusal. The show is not incapable of showing these people age, it is choosing not to allow it. Why? The most direct answer is also the most interesting one. The Simpsons are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as this show has always depicted it, cannot be permitted to change. Homer must be middle-aged, Marge must be patient, Bart must be rebellious, Lisa must be idealistic, Maggie must be silent. These are not just character traits, they are the structural requirements of a mythology. Homer represents a specific kind of American manhood, defined by its failures and its persistence and its fundamental decency despite everything. Marge represents the connective tissue of the American family, the labor of keeping the whole fragile structure upright. Bart represents the irreverent, defiant American energy that refuses to accept the world as it is. Lisa represents the American conscience, the part that knows better and keeps saying so even when nobody is listening. If Bart goes to college, the myth changes. If Lisa gets her PhD and moves to a city where her intelligence is valued, the family is no longer intact in the particular way the myth requires. If Homer retires and Marge has the house to herself and Maggie starts talking, the show is no longer about the American family in its foundational form. It is about something else. Something more specific and less universal. The floating timeline is the mechanism by which the show preserves its status as a myth rather than a story. Myths do not progress, they repeat. They cycle through the same essential events, the same essential characters, the same essential dynamics, because the value of a myth is not in its progression toward a conclusion, but in its continuous reenactment of the truths it carries. The Simpsons does not age because the myth cannot age. The loop is not a failure of imagination, it is the cost of immortality. And perhaps the most honest thing the show has ever said about this is said not in dialogue or in plot, but in the structure itself. In the fact that you can watch any episode from any season and find the same family in the same house, doing variations on the same things. In the fact that the show has now outlasted the careers of some of its original writers, the childhoods of its original young viewers, the first marriages of its original audience members, the lives of some of its original creators. The Simpsons has become a kind of time capsule that is also a time machine. You can go back to any point and find the family exactly as you left them. The couch is the same, the kitchen is the same, the refrigerator hum is the same, Homer's sigh before he opens the front door is the same. And perhaps that constancy is not just a production necessity or a narrative choice, or even a myth-making strategy. Perhaps it is a promise. The promise that wherever you are when you return to Springfield, however much time has passed on your side of the screen, the family will be there. The same family, the same house. The same love that is imperfect and loud and chaotic and real. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still standing. And every time we do, we make it a little harder for the Simpsons to escape the amber we have sealed them in. Because if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11, the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of America it represents was always temporary. Was always one birthday away from becoming something unrecognizable. We pressed pause in 1989. We never pressed play. And 36 years later, the family is still on the couch, waiting for the episode that never comes, the one where time finally starts moving again. Section 11. Hans Mollemann's Death Loop and Ned Flanders' Dark Secret. Let us talk about the two smaller mysteries that the show has been accumulating in the background for decades. The ones that are easy to miss if you are not paying attention, but that fit the larger pattern in ways that are difficult to dismiss once you see them. The first is a body count. Hans Moleman. If you have watched the show for any length of time, you know him. The tiny, elderly, extremely unfortunate man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists almost exclusively to suffer. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He falls into sinkholes. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He is subjected to a range of physical calamities that would be extreme for a cartoon character even by the show's own generous standards. And the show has killed Hans Moleman dozens of times. Not in Treehouse of Horror episodes, which the show designates as non-canonical horror parodies. Not in dream sequences. In regular episodes. Canonical episodes. Episodes that are part of the show's official continuity. Molman dies. The following episode begins. He is back. No explanation. No resurrection scene. No acknowledgement that the man who appeared in the background of last week's episode was dead. He simply shows up again, apparently fine, ready to be killed again. Most viewers absorb this as a recurring gag. Molman dies a lot. It is a running joke. Do not examine it. But through the frameworks we have been building tonight, Molman's death loop is not simply a gag, it is a symptom. If the radiation theory is the lens, Molman could represent the most extreme biological mutation in Springfield. A man whose cellular structure has been so fundamentally altered by decades of exposure to the power plant's contamination that his body can reconstitute itself after what should be fatal trauma. He is not surviving injuries the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals. Molman actually dies, in the clinical sense, and then reappears. If Burns's radiation treatments can keep a man alive through every disease known to medicine simultaneously, it is not categorically impossible that the same contamination has done something to Molman's biology that makes death a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. If the coma theory is the lens, Molman is a minor character in Homer's dream, a background figure that the dreaming brain does not maintain consistently between sleep cycles. He dies because Homer's unconscious mind occasionally lets peripheral characters lapse when the dream is not focused on them. He reappears because the dream needs him to populate the next scene. He is not a person in this reading. He is a prop, a piece of furniture that the dreaming brain periodically breaks and then rebuilds because the dream needs a certain density of human presence to feel real. If the collective denial theory is the lens, Molman's deaths are simply one more thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies visibly, publicly, in front of witnesses, on a regular basis. Nobody calls for an ambulance. Nobody investigates the fact that he keeps returning. Nobody asks the obvious questions. The town has normalized Molman's death cycle the way it has normalized the three-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire in the woods, and the baby who shot a man. It is simply another aspect of Springfield's reality that the social contract requires everyone to look past. And there is one more detail about Molman that is easy to overlook. He once stated his age as 31. 31. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s, minimum. His face suggests a man who has been old for a very long time. His body is frail, in a way that suggests decades of cumulative damage. His vision is so poor he is essentially blind. If he is telling the truth, and within the show's own continuity there is no reason to assume he is lying, something aged him catastrophically beyond his years. Something took a man in his early 30s and compressed decades of biological aging into what should have been the prime of his life. Something that also apparently made him extraordinarily resistant to dying despite his apparent extreme frailty. The radiation theory has an answer for this. The coma theory has an answer. The collective denial theory has an answer. The only framework that does not have an answer is the one that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon and none of this merits examination. Now, Ned Flanders? Ned is the character the show has quietly, methodically, over 36 years, destroyed more thoroughly than any other. And the darkness hiding behind his relentless, unbroken positivity is one of the most unsettling undercurrents in the entire series. On the surface, Ned Flanders is everything Homer is not. He is kind. He is generous. He is devoutly and sincerely religious. He is physically fit and financially responsible, and a good parent and a good neighbor. He is, by virtually any objective measure, a better person than Homer in almost every way that most value systems recognize. And the show punishes him for it without mercy. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon misfired. The shirts were aimed at Homer, who was in the bleachers dodging them enthusiastically. They hit Maud instead. She fell from the bleachers. She died. Homer's selfishness, his reflexive prioritization of his own entertainment over basic social awareness of the people around him, literally caused the death of Ned's wife. And Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He absorbs punishment that would break most people and responds with grace and patience and a faith that there is meaning in the suffering, that God has a plan, that all of this is part of something larger and more purposeful than it appears. But then the show reveals what Ned's forgiveness actually costs him. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it so carelessly, so incompetently that it collapses almost immediately. Ned has a complete psychological collapse. He screams at the town. He insults every person who has wronged him, naming names and specific incidents with the specificity of someone who has been cataloging these grievances for years. He says things he has been holding inside for decades. Things the show reveals have been building pressure beneath the surface of his relentless good cheer for his entire life. And then he is institutionalized. He checks into a mental health facility. And while he is there, a psychiatrist reveals what is underneath Ned's niceness. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, beatnik free spirits who did not believe in discipline in any form, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years systematically conditioning the aggression out of him through behavioral modification. The psychiatrist worked until there was nothing left in Ned's external behavior but compliance and warmth and the reflexive performance of goodness. Ned's kindness is not a character trait. It is a psychological cage built by a doctor around a child who was never allowed to choose it. Everything about Ned reads differently once you understand this. His patience with Homer, across decades of Homer causing him genuine harm, is not saintly virtue. It is pathology. His brain was wired, before he was old enough to choose otherwise, to suppress anger at all costs. He cannot express rage, because the pathways that would allow him to do so were systematically closed during his childhood. The conditioning did not remove the anger. It just removed his ability to act on it or even fully acknowledge it to himself. His faith is not the expression of a spiritual conviction that has been tested and refined and emerged stronger from that testing. It is a coping mechanism, an external framework for a man who needs something to explain why he keeps suffering, despite doing everything the framework tells him to do. God is Ned's way of making the ongoing punishment meaningful. Without the faith, the suffering is simply arbitrary, and arbitrary suffering is harder to survive than suffering that has a purpose. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is perhaps the most painful example of this. It is not grace. It is the programmed response of a man whose brain was conditioned, as a child, to never under any circumstances allow himself to feel the full weight of the rage that lives underneath the smile. Homer caused Maude's death. Ned knows this. Ned has processed this. And Ned's response is to forgive, because forgiving is the only option his conditioning leaves open. The show has shown us what happens when the conditioning fails. When Ned's breakdown comes, when the system finally cannot hold, the person underneath is not what anyone expected. Not a violent man, though the show hints at that capacity existing. A man whose despair is bottomless. A man who has been performing goodness for so long that he does not quite know what is underneath the performance. A man who has done everything right, by every standard the performance requires, and received nothing from the world that the performance was supposed to earn. And here is the piece that the show embeds almost casually, but that is devastating once you notice it. God talks to Homer in multiple episodes, in direct face-to-face conversations, in dreams and visions, and direct divine communication. God speaks to Homer Simpson. God has advice for Homer. God has opinions about Homer's choices. God is, within the show's own cosmology, meaningfully and personally engaged with Homer's life. God never speaks to Ned Flanders. Ned prays constantly. Ned lives his entire existence as an expression of faith. Ned has organized every aspect of his life around the belief that God is present and attentive, and that faithful living will be rewarded or at least acknowledged. And God, in the show's own universe where God demonstrably exists and demonstrably speaks to people, has nothing to say to Ned. The man who falls asleep in church gets divine conversation. The man who has dedicated his entire life to faith gets silence. That is not accidental. That is a thesis statement. The Simpsons is telling you that in Springfield, goodness is not rewarded, kindness is not protected, moral behavior is not recognized by the systems that govern the world of the show. The system, whether it is Burns's empire, or the radiation, or the collective social contract, or the coma dream, or some combination of all of these, does not care about moral behavior. It cares about what it needs and what it can use. And Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield. He was engineered to be compliant before he was old enough to refuse. He gives and forgives and serves and tolerates and believes and performs all the virtues the social order claims to value. And his reward is a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who will never fully appreciate or understand him, and a God who apparently has plenty to say to the man next door, but has never once answered Ned's prayers in any audible form. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not consistently punish wrongness. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who does not, has never once narrowed. Because the system is not designed to close it. The system is designed to keep Homer at the plant, and Ned at the church, and Burns at the top of the hierarchy, and Molman in the ground, and everyone exactly where they have always been. In a loop that never breaks. In a town that never changes. In a show that has been running long enough to outlast the hopes and the certainties of everyone who started watching it. Section 12. The Unified Theory. Everything connects. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We found the mutation in the water and traced it back to the cracked cooling towers and the man who owned them and chose not to fix them. We followed the logic of a coma all the way to the question of whether every episode since 1993 is a love letter from a man who cannot wake up. We reopened a shooting investigation and found evidence that the official answer may have been the convenient answer rather than the true one. We traced the life of a man who may have been alive for over a century through the specific machinery of wealth that keeps him running. We watched a town vote to exile truth. We looked behind a baby's silence and found something extraordinary. We counted the predictions that came true and the ones that were forgotten. We followed a mother's disappearance through 3 generations of damage. We searched for a town on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere. We stared at the floating timeline until it stared back. Every theory we explored tonight used different evidence, different reasoning, different assumptions about what the show is and what it is trying to tell you. They are not all compatible with each other in every detail. The coma theory and the radiation theory offer different explanations for why Homer survives the unsurvivable. The collective denial theory and the radiation theory offer different explanations for why the town keeps forgetting. These frameworks overlap and sometimes contradict, but all of them arrive at the same conclusion. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental. Something structural, something that goes deeper than art style or narrative convention or the standard logic of episodic television. And the show has been telling you about it, quietly and openly and from every possible angle, since the very first episode. Not through exposition, not through dramatic reveals in season finales. Through accumulation, through the patient, 36-year process of laying detail on top of detail, until the picture becomes something that cannot quite be unseen. The show is not hiding its mysteries. Springfield is not concealing its secrets. The evidence is all there. In every episode, in every callback, in every moment where something happens that should not be possible and nobody in Springfield stops to ask why. Nobody asks because Springfield will not allow the asking. The town maintains its fiction through the mechanism the principal and the pauper made explicit. Collective agreement, enforced by the social contract that says we do not acknowledge what we cannot afford to acknowledge. The radiation compromises the cognition that would make the acknowledgement possible. The coma dream prevents the dreamer from ever asking questions that might wake him up. Burns's wealth and power ensure that the people with the means to investigate have no incentive to do so. All the theories are, in this sense, aspects of a single unified theory. They are different descriptions of the same underlying reality. A town that has been comprehensively and systematically prevented from seeing itself clearly. And the audience is not exempt from this. We have been watching Springfield for long enough that we have absorbed its logic. We accept the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children, and the immortal billionaire and the baby who can organize a rebellion. We accept the reset button. We accept the collective forgetting. We accept the town that cannot be found on a map and the family that cannot age. We have become Springfield. We have been watching long enough that the things that should make us stop and ask questions are the things we are most comfortable not examining. But the theories exist because some people stopped. Some people looked at a 3-eyed fish and refused to accept it as background decoration. They pulled the thread. They followed where it went. They asked the questions that the characters cannot ask because the characters are inside the loop. And what they found, what we have been finding tonight together, is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the one the show presents on its surface. A version where Homer's cognitive impairment is not a joke about stupidity but a scar left on a child by systems that needed him damaged. Where Maggie's silence is the most strategically intelligent thing anyone in the family has done. where Burns's longevity is the logical endpoint of unchecked wealth making its own rules about what it will and will not accept, where Marge's patience is the structural, load-bearing element of an entire family's survival, where Bart's rebellion is the only honest response to a world that has demonstrably stopped making sense, where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and consistently alone, keeps asking questions that nobody wants to answer because she is the only person in Springfield who has not yet stopped looking. That is The Simpsons. 36 seasons, 788 episodes. The longest-running animated series in the history of American television. The most analyzed, theorized, debated, and beloved fictional universe in the medium. After all the theories, after all the evidence, after 2 hours spent following threads through 3 decades of storytelling, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can we not let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is the town we grew up in, whatever town that was. Maybe because Homer is every father who meant well and fell short and meant well again the next morning. Maybe because Marge is the patience that holds more families together than anyone acknowledges. Maybe because Bart is who we wanted to be and Lisa is who we knew we should be and Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep behind a careful disguise, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe it is simpler than all of that. Maybe we cannot let them go because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is gone, or in someone else's home, or in a landfill somewhere. That the world we were watching the show in during those early years is as gone as any world can be while remaining technically intact. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer stumbles through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant, we do not have to fully admit any of that. We can sit down, we can turn on the television, we can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. The loop is not their prison, it is ours. We built it, we maintain it, we tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still standing, and as long as we do, Homer will still find his way home by the end of the episode. Because in his dream, he never left. Because in ours, we never had to leave either. That house on Evergreen Terrace is still there, every Sunday night at 8 o'clock. The beer is cold, the television is on, the kids are young, and the credits have not rolled yet. The credits are never going to roll. Not because the show will run forever, though it has run longer than anyone predicted it would. Not because the characters are immortal, though several theories suggest some of them might be. But because we will not let it end. Because we are Springfield. We are the collective denial. The shared agreement to maintain the fiction, the social contract that says we will not acknowledge what we cannot afford to acknowledge. And what we cannot afford to acknowledge is this, that the family on the other side of the screen has been frozen in amber for 36 years, not because of radiation or a coma or a billionaire's machinations or the physics of cartoon logic, but because we need them to be. Because somewhere in the years since 1989, Springfield became the most stable address in America. The one place that is always exactly where we left it. The one family that is always exactly as we remember them. The one town where nothing irreversible ever happens, where every catastrophe is absorbed and forgotten, where the morning always comes and everything begins again. We pressed pause. We never pressed play. And The Simpsons will be there when you fall asleep tonight, and when you wake up, and next week, and next year, and every time you need to go somewhere that does not change. Springfield will be here. It always is. That is the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you made it all the way here, that means something. Sleep well. End of script. Expanded sections, additional depth and evidence. Section 1 extended. The power plant and the poison in plain sight. There is something specific about the way The Simpsons introduces the power plant in the very first episode that most people do not notice because they are too busy being introduced to the characters and the world. The plant is not shown as a threat in the pilot. It is not framed as something dark or sinister. It is shown as a workplace. A place Homer goes. A place that has morning shifts and lunch breaks and co-workers and vending machines and the rhythms of ordinary employment. The plant in those early episodes is almost warm. It is familiar. It is the backdrop against which a working-class father earns the money that keeps his family housed and fed and together. This is deliberate. The show needed you to be comfortable with the plant before it started showing you what the plant was doing to everyone around it. It needed you to accept the plant as a normal part of Springfield's texture before it started embedding evidence in the background that the plant was anything but normal. Because by the time you have spent a few seasons inside Springfield, by the time the plant feels like furniture, by the time Homer's commute and Homer's workstation and Homer's donut consumption at that workstation have become as familiar as anything in your own life, you are no longer looking at the plant the way you should be looking at it. You are looking at it the way the people of Springfield look at it, as a fact, as a constant, as a thing that simply exists and has always existed and whose implications you have stopped examining because examining them would require you to take a step back and see the whole picture. And the whole picture is not comfortable. Let us spend more time on the violations, because 342 is a number that deserves more attention than it typically gets. Safety regulations at nuclear facilities are not bureaucratic formalities. They are, in most cases, the accumulated lessons of actual disasters. The regulations that govern radioactive waste disposal exist because uncontrolled disposal of radioactive material has caused measurable harm to real populations. The regulations that govern cooling tower maintenance exist because cooling tower failures at nuclear facilities have released radioactive steam into the surrounding environment. The regulations that govern proximity of workers to reactor cores exist because radiation exposure at certain levels causes cancer, cellular damage, neurological effects, and multi-generational biological consequences. Every single one of the 342 violations at the Springfield plant represents a specific, documented type of risk to the surrounding population. Not a theoretical risk, a risk that has been studied, measured, and regulated against because the harm it can cause has been observed in real situations. Burns refused to address any of them, not because he did not understand the risks. Burns is the most intelligent person in Springfield. He has been running a nuclear facility for longer than most of the safety regulations themselves have existed. He knows what uncontrolled radiation exposure does to biological systems because he is personally managing its effects in his own body every single week. He refused because the cost of acknowledging the risks was higher than the cost of concealing them. And the concealment required cooperation. The plant has a safety inspector. The plant has workers who see the violations every day. The plant operates in a town with a mayor, a police chief, a local government, and proximity to state and federal regulatory bodies. For the violations to persist unaddressed for decades, for the contaminated water to keep flowing, and the cracked towers to keep leaking, and the luminous rats to keep multiplying in the walls, a significant number of people had to be either paid to look away, too cognitively compromised to recognize what they were seeing, or too economically dependent on Burns's continued operation to risk antagonizing him. Probably all three, in varying proportions, at various points over the decades. The economic dependency is particularly important. Springfield's entire economy is organized around the power plant in ways the show depicts gradually but consistently. The plant is the largest employer in town. Burns is the largest individual taxpayer. The plant's continued operation is, in a very practical sense, the thing that keeps Springfield financially viable as a community. If the plant closed, or even if its operations were significantly curtailed by enforcement of the safety regulations, the economic ripple effects would be severe. Burns knows this. He has structured it this way deliberately. The plant's economic centrality to Springfield is not an accident of geography or history. It is a design feature. A billionaire who makes himself indispensable to a community's survival does not need to threaten anyone explicitly. The threat is structural. It is embedded in the dependence itself. The town knows that challenging Burns means challenging the thing that keeps the town alive, and so the town does not challenge Burns. It looks at the cracked cooling towers and decides that the towers are probably fine. It looks at the luminous rats and decides that rats are probably always like that. It looks at the three-eyed fish and decides to eat it on live television and then move on. The denial is not stupidity. The denial is economic survival dressed in the clothes of willful blindness. But there is a layer beneath even the economic dependency, a layer that the show embeds in the biology of the situation itself. Consider what decades of low-level radiation exposure does to the human brain. The show depicts Homer's IQ as approximately 55, a number that places him in the range of significant cognitive impairment. The show tells us a crayon is partly responsible for this. But the crayon is not the whole story, and the show knows it. Even without the crayon, even after the crayon is removed and Homer's IQ rises dramatically, he remains in Springfield. He remains in the contaminated environment. He continues drinking the contaminated water and breathing the contaminated air. The cognitive improvement from removing the crayon is real, but not permanent in its full effect because the environmental factors that contributed to his impairment are still present. The radiation does not just affect physical characteristics, it affects cognition. The show implies this repeatedly through the population of Springfield as a whole, a population that consistently makes decisions that seem, from the outside, almost inexplicably poor, that consistently fails to connect obvious dots, that consistently looks at evidence of systemic harm and concludes that everything is fine. This is not stupidity, this is damage. Specifically, the kind of neurological damage that results from chronic, low-level radiation exposure affecting the prefrontal cortex and the neural systems responsible for long-term planning, pattern recognition, and the ability to weigh abstract future risks against immediate concrete comforts. Springfield cannot see what is happening to it because the thing that is happening to it has specifically targeted the part of its population's collective brain that would otherwise be capable of seeing it. Burns engineered this, not necessarily through a specific, deliberate plan at a specific moment in time, but through the ongoing choice to let the violations persist, to keep Homer in the safety inspector role, to ensure that the contamination continued at a level that was catastrophic slowly enough that nobody noticed the catastrophe happening. The slow catastrophe is the most effective kind. It does not produce a moment of crisis that demands a response. It produces a gradual decline that the people inside it experience as normal, because every stage of the decline is only slightly worse than the stage before it, and the stage before it had already been accepted as normal. Springfield has been in a slow catastrophe for decades, and the slow catastrophe has been, for Burns, an extraordinarily profitable arrangement. Let us look at the Blinky moment one more time, because the show's handling of it is more sophisticated than it appears. Blinky becomes national news. A gubernatorial candidate uses the fish as a campaign issue. Burns is forced to respond publicly, which he does by eating the fish on television, a gesture designed to communicate confidence and safety, and the message that if the plant's owner himself is willing to eat this fish, it cannot be as dangerous as his critics claim. The governor's race is resolved. The issue of Springfield's environmental contamination is effectively closed as a political matter. And Burns wins, not because he demonstrated that the fish was safe, but because he performed confidence convincingly enough that the audience watching at home decided the performance was the same as the proof. The performance was not the proof. Burns ate one fish, on television, once, with cameras rolling and his own survival instinct at its maximum alertness. He did not commission an independent environmental study. He did not open the plant's internal records to public scrutiny. He did not invite regulators to review the records of what has been discharged into the river and when and in what quantities. He ate a piece of fish on television and smiled. And that was enough, because Springfield was already primed, through the mechanisms we have discussed, to accept the performance as a substitute for the proof. This is Burns at his most strategically brilliant. He does not need to actually solve the problem. He needs to perform the solution convincingly enough that the people watching do not feel compelled to look any further. And in a town whose population's critical thinking capacity has been systematically compromised by decades of environmental contamination, the bar for a convincing performance is not high. The fish moment is a template. It is the method Burns uses throughout the show for managing public concern about the plant. When something threatens to become a genuine crisis, Burns does not address it. He performs addressing it. He appears on television, he makes statements, he invites selected scrutiny while controlling the terms of that scrutiny, and then he waits for the attention to move elsewhere. It always does, because Springfield's population cannot sustain the attention required to follow through. Their capacity for persistent focus on a single issue, particularly an issue with abstract long-term consequences, has been damaged in exactly the way you would expect if you were a billionaire whose facility had been leaking low-level radiation into the community's water and air for several decades. The contamination produced the compliance. The compliance allows the contamination to continue. The loop sustains itself indefinitely. And Homer, at the center of all of it, goes to work every morning, opens the reactor control room, eats his donut, falls asleep at the console, and ensures, through his magnificent incompetence, that the loop never breaks. He is not the cause, he is the mechanism. The thing that makes the cause invisible by standing in the place where visibility would otherwise be possible. Springfield does not have 342 safety violations because Burns is negligent. Burns is never negligent about anything that matters to him. Springfield has 342 safety violations because Burns counted them and decided that maintaining them was worth more than fixing them. That calculation has been correct, from Burns's perspective, for every single year the show has been on the air. Section 2 Extended. The Coma and the Architecture of the Dream. We have established the basic framework of the Homer coma theory. But there are layers of this theory that deserve more time, because the deeper you go into it, the more the evidence assembles itself into something that is genuinely difficult to argue against on purely structural grounds. Let us talk about what we know about how comatose brains function, not from medical literature, but from what the show itself establishes about Homer's specific condition. The 5% brain function loss is stated explicitly. The doctors tell Homer that his coma caused measurable, permanent neurological damage. 5% of his brain function is gone and will not return. The show treats this as a punchline. The family laughs. Homer laughs without knowing why he is laughing. The credits roll, but the damage is real within the show's continuity, and 5% of brain function is not a trivial amount. It is not the kind of damage that produces no behavioral effects. It is the kind of damage that would be expected to alter personality, alter memory processing, alter the ability to distinguish between what is real and what the brain is generating from internal sources rather than external input. The coma theory asks you to accept one premise: that the waking up we see in the episode is not real, that it is itself part of the dream. That Homer's brain, generating the simulation of his family and his life and his town, generated the simulation of waking up as well. Because dreaming brains do this. They generate the experience of waking as a natural part of sleep cycles. You wake up within the dream. You believe you are awake. And then the dream continues. If you accept this premise, everything else follows. The tonal shift after season 4 is not the writers changing direction. It is the dream becoming less tethered to the reality Homer's brain has reference for. The early seasons, set before the coma, represent Homer's actual lived experience, the memories his brain has genuine information about. After the coma, the brain is generating without reference material. It is creating rather than remembering. And creation without reference material is exactly what the later seasons look like. Escalating, surreal, disconnected from the grounded domestic reality of the early years. The celebrity appearances concentrate in later seasons, because Homer's brain, receiving ambient sound from the hospital environment, from televisions, from conversations, from radio playing somewhere down the hall, is incorporating those fragments into the dream. In the early seasons, the dream is running on memories. In later seasons, the memories are getting thinner, and the brain is supplementing with whatever it can pick up from outside. This would explain why the celebrity appearances feel so random and so untethered from any narrative logic. They are not chosen. They are heard. Homer's brain catches a name or a voice drifting through the coma and inserts it into the next available moment in the dream. Consider also what the dream reveals about what Homer values. In his coma dream, Homer is not a successful man. He is not wealthy. He does not live in a large or impressive house. He does not have status or power or the kind of life that success culture in America tends to define as aspirational. He has a modest house in a modest neighborhood, and a job he is not particularly good at, and a family that is chaotic and imperfect, and deeply, persistently, unconditionally his. The dream does not give Homer what the world says people should want. It gives Homer what Homer actually wants. And that distinction is, in its own way, one of the most quietly moving things about the show. Homer's deepest want is not complicated. It is the family at the dinner table. It is Bart's laugh. It is the sound of Lisa's saxophone coming through the walls of the house. It is Marge standing at the stove on a Tuesday evening. It is Maggie in the car seat, watching the world through enormous eyes. It is the familiar smell of the living room, the specific weight of the couch, the sound of the television. The dream gives him all of this, in perfect, unaging preservation, for as long as the dream lasts. And the dream protects these things by never allowing them to end. The narrative reset that happens between episodes, the mechanism that fans call the reset button and writers call episodic structure, is the dream refusing to allow permanent loss. Something terrible happens. The dream absorbs it. By the next episode, it is resolved. Homer's family is intact, the house is intact, Evergreen Terrace is intact, everything he is dreaming of still exists. The dream cannot afford to let any of it be permanently destroyed, because permanent destruction would mean Homer's subconscious accepting that the things he loves are gone, and accepting that would mean the dream no longer has a reason to sustain itself. The reset button is grief management. The episodic structure is a comatose man's brain refusing to process the loss of his family by simply refusing to allow loss to be permanent within the world it is generating. Every episode ends with everything intact. Every season resets to the same configuration. The same house, the same family, the same neighborhood, the same Saturday morning light through the same kitchen window. Because the dream needs this. The dreamer needs this. More than he needs excitement or adventure or any of the escalating absurdities the later seasons provide, Homer needs the family to still be there when the credits roll. And they always are. There is one additional piece of evidence that does not get discussed as often as the others, but that fits the theory with particular precision. The show has, over its run, depicted moments of what can only be described as the dream becoming aware of itself. Moments where the fourth wall is addressed not as a joke, but as something stranger. Episodes where characters seem to almost reach a recognition that their world is not quite what it appears to be, before the recognition is deflected or resolved and the episode moves on. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the most explicit version of this. The show designates them as non-canonical, specifically because they allow the characters to die, to experience genuine, irreversible horror, to engage with the darkest possible versions of their situation. They are the moments when the dream becomes a nightmare before correcting itself. And significantly, they always correct themselves. They are always designated as separate, as outside the main continuity, as something that does not count. The dream knows, on some level, that it cannot afford to let the nightmare version become the permanent version, so it quarantines it. It puts the horror in a clearly labeled box and says, this is the exception, this is separate, this does not carry forward. The regular dream, the one that matters, the one where the family is intact and the house is standing and Homer finds his way home, that is what continues. That is always what continues. And here is the detail that, once you notice it, is hard to unnotice. In the Treehouse of Horror episodes, Homer dies frequently and graphically. In the regular episodes, Homer cannot die. He can be injured to a degree that would be fatal to any normal human being. He can suffer damage that the show itself acknowledges as medically impossible to survive. But he does not die. He comes back. Every single time. The dream cannot kill the dreamer. Homer's body is in a hospital bed in Springfield General. His body can be harmed but not eliminated because the dream is generated by that body, by that brain, and the dream cannot generate the ending of the thing that generates it. Homer is functionally immortal within the dream, not because of cartoon logic or narrative convenience, but because the dreamer cannot dream themselves out of existence. When you understand this, Homer's survival of impossible situations stops being a joke about the show's stakes and becomes something else. It becomes evidence. It is the dream protecting itself. It is the comatose mind refusing to simulate its own termination, because simulating its own termination would require the kind of self-awareness that would wake the sleeper. And the sleeper cannot wake up. Not yet, maybe not ever, because the family is still there. The dream is still running. And there is no alarm set for morning on Evergreen Terrace. Section 3 extended. The Burns, shooting, and the evidence nobody followed. The Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery deserves more space than we gave it the first time, because there are threads that were not fully pulled. Let us talk about the DNA evidence. The investigation pivots on an eyelash found on Burns's suit, analyzed and identified as belonging to a member of the Simpson family. This evidence is what drives the investigation toward Homer and eventually toward the conclusion that a Simpson was the shooter. But the collection of this evidence is never shown on screen. The analysis is never independently verified within the episode. The chain of custody, the documentation of how the eyelash was found and by whom and what protocols were followed in its preservation and analysis, is never established. Chief Wiggum's department finds the eyelash and runs the DNA, and the results point to the Simpsons, and the episode treats this as settled. Chief Wiggum's department, the Springfield Police Department, an organization the show has spent years establishing as catastrophically incompetent. An organization whose chief has made errors so profound and so consistent that his continued employment can only be explained by the same kind of political protection that has always shielded Burns from accountability. The Springfield Police Department finds evidence that points to a Simpson, and the episode treats their forensic work as reliable. This is a significant assumption that the show makes without comment. If the real shooter was someone other than a Simpson, if the framing of the investigation was deliberate rather than the result of genuine evidence, then planting a Simpson hair on Burns's suit would be a straightforward way to redirect the investigation. One eyelash. That is all it takes. One eyelash in the right place by someone with access to Burns's location before the ambulance arrived, and the investigation has a target that moves it away from the actual truth. Who had access to Burns's location in the immediate aftermath of the shooting? Who was at the town meeting? Who knew Burns's movements that night? Who, among the people in Springfield, with both the motive and the capability to influence a police investigation, would have benefited from the investigation focusing on a Simpson rather than on the actual shooter? Smithers knew Burns's movements better than anyone. Smithers had just been fired and was in a state of severe emotional distress. Smithers later confesses to the shooting himself, a confession that falls apart not because it is clearly false, but because the timeline Smithers provides for his actions that night cannot be reconciled with the forensic evidence of when Burns was shot. Or rather, the timeline cannot be reconciled if you accept the other evidence uncritically. What if the Smithers confession was genuine and the timeline discrepancy was manufactured? What if Smithers shot Burns in a moment of rage and grief over being fired, and then used his knowledge of how the investigation would proceed to introduce doubt about his own timeline, knowing that the confession would be dismissed as soon as an alibi, however shaky, could be established? Smithers is not stupid. Smithers is, operationally, one of the most competent people in Springfield. He manages an extraordinarily complex principle with extraordinary efficiency. He anticipates problems before they develop. He maintains systems that require constant attention and adjustment. If Smithers wanted to confess to something and then have his confession dismissed, he would know exactly how to make that happen. The confession that clears itself is a remarkably clean outcome. Then there is Homer's Season 18 statement, the throwaway line where Homer says he shot Burns. The show plays this as a non sequitur, as something Homer says without consequence or follow-up. Nobody investigates. Nobody takes it seriously. It evaporates from the narrative immediately. But within the show's internal logic, a confession of attempted murder is not nothing. Even a confession made casually in a conversational setting is evidence. Even Chief Wiggum's department might be expected to, at minimum, register that Homer Simpson said out loud that he shot Mr. Burns, and perhaps ask a follow-up question or two. The fact that nothing happens after the confession is itself strange. The show has established that Springfield's legal system, however dysfunctional, does eventually respond to clear evidence of crimes. People in Springfield get arrested, people get prosecuted. The legal machinery exists and operates, however imperfectly. Homer confesses to shooting Burns and nothing happens. Either the confession is not taken seriously because everyone in Springfield knows Homer says things without thinking and means them approximately 40% of the time, or the legal system of Springfield is not pursuing the confession because someone with influence over that legal system does not want the matter reopened, or Homer is lying, for reasons of his own, in a way that the show never fully explains. All three possibilities leave the official solution to the mystery less settled than the show wants it to appear. And then there is the matter of what Burns saw. Burns was shot. He was in a parking lot. It was after the town meeting. He had just made an enemy of every person in Springfield. His holster was empty, his gun already missing. He was approached by someone he recognized, someone whose presence he acknowledged calmly with the words, "Oh, it's you." The show wants us to read, "Oh, it's you," as Burns recognizing the baby who had apparently encountered him in the parking lot while he was trying to take her lollipop. But "oh, it's you" in the tone the show uses is not the greeting of a man who has just seen a baby unexpectedly. It is the greeting of a man who recognizes an equal, someone he has dealt with before, someone whose presence in this parking lot at this moment makes a particular kind of sense to him, not in the way that a random baby's presence makes sense, but in the way that a specific person's presence makes sense when you understand the context. It is the greeting of a man who has, on some level, been expecting to have this conversation. Burns had just fired Smithers. Smithers was the one person in Springfield who knew Burns most intimately, who had the most detailed knowledge of Burns's movements, who had the deepest personal feelings about Burns, and who had just been dismissed in the most abrupt and unceremonious way imaginable. If anyone in Springfield had the combination of knowledge, access, motive, and emotional state required to shoot Charles Montgomery Burns in a parking lot after a town meeting, it was Smithers. And if Burns saw Smithers in that parking lot, his words, "Oh, it's you," would make complete sense. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has just fired someone and is now encountering that person in a context that has certain obvious implications. The Smithers theory does not require ignoring the DNA evidence. It requires questioning the forensic integrity of an investigation conducted by the Springfield Police Department, which is something the show has already given us abundant reason to do. It does require explaining why Burns would not identify Smithers as the shooter when he woke from his coma. And the explanation the show provides, through Burns's own demonstrated behavior across dozens of episodes, is actually consistent with him protecting Smithers. Burns is not a man who allows others to determine the terms of his interactions. If Burns decided that naming Smithers was not in his interest, or if some version of complicated feeling about Smithers, the one person who had devoted decades of loyalty to him, made Burns unwilling to send him to prison, then Burns would simply not name him. Burns looked around the room when he woke up. He assessed the situation with the clarity of a man who has been making strategic calculations for over a century. He looked at the sundial letters his hands had rested on. He looked at the police officers waiting for his statement. And he said Maggie Simpson did it. Because Maggie Simpson cannot be convicted. Because naming Maggie ends the investigation without consequences for anyone. Because whatever Burns felt about the person who actually shot him, the outcome he wanted was an outcome where the story closed without any of the complications that would follow from naming the real shooter. Burns is the most strategically intelligent person in Springfield. His statement from that hospital bed was a strategic calculation, not a truthful recollection. The case was never solved. The case was closed by the most powerful man in town, telling the police what to write in their reports. And Springfield, as it always does, accepted the official version and moved on. Section 5 extended. Collective denial and the town that chose its prison. The Principal and the Pauper episode is genuinely controversial among fans in a way that most Simpsons controversies are not. Most disagreements about the show's quality are aesthetic. People argue about whether particular episodes are funny, whether certain character choices are earned, whether the writing of a given season meets the standards set by earlier ones. These are arguments about craft. The Armin Tamzarian controversy is different. People argue about it as though something real was done to them, as though the episode committed an act against the audience, not just a narrative misstep. The language fans use about it tends toward the betrayal register. The show betrayed us, the writers violated our trust, the episode invalidated years of investment in a character we believed was real. This reaction is interesting. More interesting in some ways than the episode itself. Because the episode is honest, it is doing something honest about how communities and audiences relate to the fictions they are given. The fans' sense of betrayal at discovering that Skinner's backstory was false is exactly the feeling the citizens of Springfield should be having at that same discovery. The fans' desire for the lie to be maintained so that the character they love can continue to feel real is exactly the desire the citizens of Springfield vote on at the end of the episode. The audience and the townspeople are in the same position. Both have invested in a version of Skinner that is built on fiction. Both are confronted with a truth that makes that investment feel compromised. And both, in their different ways, choose the fiction. The citizens vote explicitly. The fans vote with their canonical consensus. The Tamzarian episode is considered non-representative. A blip, an episode the fandom has largely decided not to integrate fully into their understanding of the show's continuity. The true Skinner, the fans say, is the Skinner we knew before this episode. The Tamzarian revelation is a mistake, not a fact. The fans did exactly what Springfield did. They exiled the truth and voted for the comfortable version. This parallel is too precise to be accidental. The show was making a point about its audience as much as about its fictional town. It was showing you, using the characters as a mirror, how you respond when the story you are invested in turns out to have been built on a foundation you were not told about. You do not want the true story. You want the story you already know. Now extend this to the larger pattern of Springfield's denial. The town has experienced events that should, by any reasonable measure, have permanently altered its consciousness. Events that, in any real community, would produce long-term consequences in the form of institutional change, cultural processing, communal memory, events that people would still be talking about years later. When a dome is placed over Springfield by the federal government, declaring the entire town a contamination zone, that is not an event that fades from communal memory in a week. That is a foundational trauma. That is a story that becomes part of the town's identity, something every resident carries, something that shapes the way the community relates to authority and to its own contaminated history. But by the following episode, it is as though the dome never happened. The radiation theory says this is because the contamination has damaged the population's memory and cognition. The coma theory says this is because the dreaming brain cycles between episodes and does not maintain continuity of consequence between them. But the Tamsarian theory, the collective denial theory, says something more specific and more uncomfortable. The forgetting is a choice. The reset is not a symptom of damage or the structure of a dream. It is the community actively deciding, each time, that the cost of remembering is higher than the cost of forgetting. This is not a fictional phenomenon. This is how communities actually process difficult truths about themselves. Communities that have experienced environmental contamination from industrial facilities frequently develop complex, multi-generational patterns of denial about the health effects of that contamination. The economic dependency on the contaminating facility, the discomfort of acknowledging that the source of community income is also the source of community harm, the social cost of being the person who insists on talking about the thing everyone else has agreed to stop talking about, all of these create pressure toward collective forgetting that is powerful enough to operate across generations. Springfield is an exaggerated but structurally accurate depiction of this dynamic. The show does not let anyone off the hook. Not the citizens who vote to accept the lie, not the mayor who signs the judge's decree, not the judge who issues it, not the institutions that enforce it. The episode is clear that the collective denial is a collective choice, made by people who understand on some level what they are choosing and choose it anyway. And the show has the nerve to make the audience complicit in the same choice. Because the audience, presented with a revelation that disrupts their investment in a character, generally decides to join Springfield in the vote for comfortable fiction. The true Seymour Skinner is somewhere on that train, moving away from Springfield, carrying a truth that nobody wanted. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. And the show continued, and Armin Tamsarian continued to be called Skinner, and the audience adjusted and accepted it because the alternative was confronting something that it was more comfortable not to confront. Springfield does not forget because it is broken. Springfield forgets because it has decided, rationally, given the specific constraints of its situation, that forgetting is the only viable survival strategy available to it. That is the darkest thing the Tamsarian episode reveals. Not that the town is in denial, that the denial is reasonable given the alternatives. Section 6 Extended. Maggie and the Patience of Genius. Let us sit with Maggie Simpson for a little longer, because the thing that is most extraordinary about her is not any single act but the sustained patience her silence represents. 36 years. 36 years of silence, maintained with perfect consistency, in a household full of noise, surrounded by people who talk constantly, in a town where information travels at the speed of a neighbor leaning over a fence. 36 years of watching, listening, processing, and saying nothing that was not carefully calibrated in its effect. That is not developmental delay. No form of developmental delay produces that level of consistent, strategic behavior sustained across that length of time. That is a sustained performance of non-threatening dependence, maintained with a discipline that most adults could not match. Consider what Maggie knows. She has been in the room for every significant family conversation for 3 decades. She has watched Homer and Marge navigate their marriage, their finances, their relationship to Burns and to the community, their individual crises and their shared ones. She has watched Bart develop his particular relationship with authority and with the boundaries of what can be gotten away with. She has watched Lisa fight for recognition in a household and community that consistently undervalues what she offers. She has been in the room for all of it, and she has been assessed, consistently, as the one member of the family who is too young to understand what is happening around her. She understands everything. The show tells you this repeatedly. In moments that land as comedy but carry a different weight when you look at them collectively. The moment when Maggie's IQ test results come back, and the tester looks at them with barely concealed shock. The moment in the longest daycare when Maggie defeats a security system that adults have designed with no awareness that an infant might want to defeat it. The moment when Maggie is left alone in the room and performs the trigger pull gesture with the careful self-awareness of someone who understands the implications of being observed doing it. These are not a baby's accidental moments of apparent competence. These are the visible fraction of a larger intelligence that keeps the rest of itself hidden. The visible fraction is itself extraordinary. What is the rest of it? The theory that Maggie's silence is strategic rests on a reading of her as someone who has observed that visibility has costs in Springfield. Lisa is visible. Lisa pays those costs every day. Lisa's intelligence makes her a target, makes her lonely, makes her an inconvenience in a community that prefers its members to be comfortable rather than challenging. Lisa knows things and says them, and the community responds by trying to silence her in other ways, through mockery, through dismissal, through the social pressure that says people who make others uncomfortable are the problem rather than the things they are making others uncomfortable about. Maggie watched this and arrived at a different strategy. If the costs of visibility are high, if being recognized as intelligent and capable and perceptive is what gets you isolated in Springfield, then the optimal play is to be unrecognized, to fly so far under every radar that nobody even thinks to look for you there, to maintain the disguise so completely that your actual capabilities are never assessed, never measured, never made into a reason to treat you as a threat or an inconvenience. A baby who cannot speak and cannot walk without falling is not a threat to anyone. A bacilli is not going to expose the secrets that Springfield runs on. A baby is not going to ask the questions that make the adults in the room uncomfortable. A baby is safe to have in the room when the adults are talking about things they would not want a more cognizant observer to hear. Maggie has been in the room for everything. The show has also established, in various episodes, that there are moments when Maggie breaks the disguise slightly. Moments where she demonstrates, to a single character or in a context where the evidence cannot be used, that she understands far more than she appears to. And in each of those moments, she quickly reassembles the appearance of not understanding and returns to the pacifier and the large eyes and the infantile helplessness that is her armor. She breaks character only when necessary, only when the situation demands it, and only when she can control who sees it. That level of impulse control, that capacity to resist demonstrating capability even when demonstrating it would be satisfying, is itself extraordinary. Most people, given a cognitive ability significantly beyond their peers, feel some pull toward demonstrating it. The desire for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the experience of being seen accurately rather than as something lesser than you are, is powerful. Maggie has suppressed this desire for 36 years. Either she has no such desire, which would suggest a psychological architecture unusual enough to be its own kind of extraordinary, or she has the desire and has chosen to override it consistently, which suggests a level of self-discipline and long-term strategic thinking that is, depending on how you look at it, either deeply impressive or deeply unsettling. The question of what Maggie is building toward remains genuinely open. She is accumulating knowledge. She is accumulating understanding of how Springfield works, how the family works, how the systems of power and denial that structure her world actually function. She is accumulating this in silence, with no observable agenda, with no declared goals, with no indication of timeline. She is, in this reading, the most patient person in Springfield. More patient than Ned Flanders, whose patience is pathological rather than chosen. More patient than Marge, whose patience is love expressed as endurance. More patient than anyone, because Maggie's patience is the patience of someone who has decided to wait until the right moment, rather than being forced to wait by circumstances outside her control. What is the right moment? The show does not tell us. It has never told us. And that ambiguity, that open question hanging over 36 years of careful silence, is perhaps the most genuinely suspenseful thing in the show's entire run. Maggie is waiting. For what, we do not know. But when the moment comes, Springfield will not see it coming. She designed it that way. Section 7 extended. Predictions, culture, and the mirror that became a map. The prediction phenomenon deserves one more pass, because there is an aspect of it that neither the supernatural reading nor the pure coincidence reading captures. The Simpsons writing staff in its peak years was not just educated. It was specifically educated in fields that are particularly useful for predicting cultural and technological trends: mathematics, physics, economics, political theory, media studies. These are disciplines that deal in models, in the behavior of systems over time, in the identification of patterns that are not yet visible on the surface of events, but that are already present in the underlying data. A mathematician who has studied how trends compound and accelerate over time, looking at the early history of portable computing in the mid-1990s, could plausibly extrapolate towards something resembling a smartwatch, not through prophecy but through the application of a model to available data. The data suggested a trajectory. The mathematician followed the trajectory to its logical next point. A political theorist who has studied the history of celebrity and media culture in America, looking at Donald Trump's relationship with the press and his decades-long flirtation with political candidacy, could extrapolate toward a Trump presidency without any supernatural assistance. The data was there. The pattern was visible to anyone who knew where to look and what to look for. The Simpsons writers were people who knew where to look and what to look for. This does not fully explain the most specific predictions, the ones where the match is detailed enough that statistical probability struggles to account for it. The Siegfried and Roy Tiger attack. The Cypress Hill collaboration, specific in its detail down to the exact combination of performers. These are harder to attribute purely to trend extrapolation because they do not involve trends. They involve specific events. For these, the most satisfying explanation may be the one that is also the most philosophically interesting, that the show's long cultural presence created conditions in which its own jokes influenced the behavior of the people who heard them. When an episode of The Simpsons depicts a specific thing happening, that depiction enters the cultural consciousness of everyone who watches it, and the cultural consciousness is not inert, it shapes behavior. It shapes what people think of as possible, what people think of as plausible, what people imagine when they imagine the future. It is not impossible that someone involved in booking the actual Cypress Hill London Symphony Orchestra collaboration had, somewhere in their cultural memory, the vague impression that this was something that happened, or that this was a thing, without clearly remembering that the thing they were remembering was a 28-year-old Simpsons gag. The impression was there. The impression shaped what was considered imaginable, and the imaginable became the actual. This is not supernatural. It is the ordinary mechanism by which culture creates the conditions for the events it depicts. The Simpsons is not predicting the future. The Simpsons is, in some cases, helping to create it, which makes the show something stranger than a prophetic text. It makes the show an active participant in the unfolding of American culture, not through intention but through the unavoidable consequence of being embedded so deeply in the cultural imagination of so many people for so long that its content has become part of the shared reference point from which those people make decisions and generate possibilities. America did not become Springfield because The Simpsons predicted it. America became Springfield because The Simpsons showed enough people what Springfield looked like that the image became a template for what political absurdity looks like. A template for what corporate malfeasance looks like. A template for what the relationship between a powerful institution and a dependent community looks like. The show wrote down the structure of a thing, and the people who read it used that structure, mostly unconsciously, when they built the real version. That is the genuine strangeness of the prediction phenomenon. Not that the show knew, but that knowing changed what happened. Section 8 extended. Mona and the costs of resistance. Mona Simpson's story is the show's most direct statement about the relationship between political resistance and the price that resistance extracts from the people who engage in it. She made a choice in 1969. She saw something that she believed was genuinely wrong, something that endangered people who did not know they were in danger, and she took action against it. She joined people who shared her understanding of what was wrong. She put herself at physical risk to do something she believed needed doing. She succeeded. In the narrow sense, the biological weapons were destroyed, and the cost of that success was everything. Her family, her identity, her ability to exist as herself in any settled way. 27 years of her son's life, experienced from the outside, from newspapers and occasional glimpses, from the imagination of a woman who could not hold the child she had kissed goodbye on the morning she left and never came back. The show does not tell this story in a way that suggests Mona's choice was wrong. It does not retroactively endorse Burns's biological weapons program as something that should have been left alone. The show takes seriously that what Mona did was morally justified and that the consequences she suffered were unjust. But it is honest about the consequences. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the more exciting details of the conspiracy, the biological weapons lab, the germ warfare, the FBI pursuit, the generational damage, the quiet, devastating part, that Mona Simpson did something right and was punished for it comprehensively and without recourse. Burns did not forgive the attack on his lab. Burns does not forgive. Burns catalogs. Burns waits. Burns uses the patience that a century of survival has given him to pursue grievances across timescales that would exhaust any ordinary opponent. 27 years after the raid on his biological weapons facility, Burns spotted Mona's face through a cab window and made a phone call. Because he had not forgotten. Because for a man who has been alive as long as Burns has been alive, 27 years is not a long time. The message embedded in Burns's persistence is not subtle, but it is worth stating explicitly. People with enough money and enough patience can make the cost of resistance so high, can make the consequences of opposition so severe and so enduring that the rational choice for anyone watching is not to resist. The lesson of Mona's fate, learned by everyone in Springfield who knew her story or heard fragments of it, is that the costs of challenging Burns are generational. They do not fall only on the person who challenges him. They fall on that person's children and on the family structures that person leaves behind. Homer grew up emotionally shaped by an absence he did not understand. Abe spent decades maintaining a lie that he had to live inside every day. The Simpson family was fractured not by accident or tragedy, but by design, by the deliberate application of institutional power against an individual who had the audacity to challenge it. And Burns, over the course of the show's run, never faces meaningful consequences for any of this. The power plant continues to operate with its violations intact. The biological weapons lab was destroyed in 1969, but the fact that it existed is never publicly reckoned with. Burns is shot in season 6 and recovers and never faces charges. Burns blocks out the sun and the dome comes down and Springfield moves on. Burns pursues Mona across decades and she is never able to fully come home. Burns always wins. The show is honest about this. It does not offer the comfort of a moment where the system is exposed and held to account. It shows you the system operating for 36 seasons, without interruption, without consequence, with the full apparatus of wealth and influence maintaining itself precisely because it has never been forced to stop. Mona Simpson tried to force it to stop. She partially succeeded, once, with one specific facility, at the cost of her family. Burns rebuilt. He always rebuilds. That is what having enough money means in practice. It means your defeats are never permanent. It means every setback is a temporary condition that wealth can correct. It means the people who oppose you face permanent, generational consequences while you face delays. Mona's story is the show's most honest statement about power. Not the exciting version of power, where good people challenge it and are eventually vindicated in a way that feels earned and emotionally satisfying. The realistic version, where good people challenge it and win small battles and lose the larger war, and the system continues, and their children inherit the costs. Homer never fully understood this because Homer was not equipped to understand it. The tools for understanding were taken from him before he was old enough to use them. But the show understands it, and it has been saying it quietly for 36 years, inside the story of a man who strangled his son on the couch and ate donuts in a nuclear power plant and could not quite figure out why his life felt like it was happening to someone who deserved better. Section 10 Extended. The Loop We Built Together. The floating timeline is the show's final and most honest mystery, because it is the only mystery whose true answer requires looking at the audience rather than at Springfield. We have spent the last several hours exploring theories about why nobody in Springfield ages. The radiation theory, the coma theory, the collective denial theory, the Burns immortality framework as a proof of concept that aging is negotiable in this universe. Each of these theories reaches for an explanation inside the show's own logic. But the truest explanation is outside the show's logic. It is in the relationship between the show and the people watching it. The Simpsons does not age because its audience has never permitted it to age. This is not a metaphor. There have been moments in the show's history where the writers have clearly wanted to move forward, to let the characters develop, to allow the consequences of time passing to accumulate in the way that normal life allows them to accumulate. The flash-forward episodes are evidence of this impulse. So are the occasional season-long storylines that attempt something like genuine character development before the reset button returns everything to its starting configuration. The audience resists, not through explicit protest mostly, but through the measures of success that television uses to assess whether an audience is engaged. The episodes that deviate from the expected configuration, the episodes that try to change something permanent, tend to perform differently with the audience than the episodes that deliver the familiar experience in a well-executed new form. The show has learned this lesson over 36 years. The audience wants Springfield. Specifically, it wants the Springfield it has always had. The one with Homer at the plant and Marge in the kitchen, and Bart on his skateboard and Lisa on her saxophone, and Maggie in the high chair with the pacifier. The one that looks and feels and sounds like the place the audience fell in love with 36 years ago. The floating timeline is the accommodation the show has made to this preference. It allows the show to remain in the present, to engage with current events and current culture and current technology, while simultaneously keeping the characters frozen at the ages and the dynamics and the configurations that the audience fell in love with. The show exists in an eternal present tense where Homer is always 39 and Bart is always 10 and the year is always the year you are watching from. The audience built this loop. The audience maintains it. Every time someone watches the opening credits and feels the specific comfort of those 40 seconds of animation, every time someone quotes a line from a 1990s episode in a 2020s conversation, every time someone describes a current event in Simpsons terms or explains a political dynamic by reference to a Springfield dynamic, they are reinforcing the loop. They are confirming that the world of Springfield is a meaningful reference point for understanding the world outside Springfield. And every confirmation tightens the loop a little more. The Simpsons has become a kind of shared cultural infrastructure, not just entertainment, infrastructure. The way that certain nursery rhymes or fairy tales or national myths function as shared reference points that people use to make sense of experience, The Simpsons has become that for a generation of Americans and for a significant portion of the global television audience. It is a shared language. A shared set of images and situations and relationships that people reach for when they need to communicate something quickly and clearly. You cannot retire shared cultural infrastructure. You cannot let the American family grow old and move on, because the infrastructure is not for the characters, it is for the people using it. The loop is ours. The frozen timeline serves our needs, not the characters. We press the button, we keep the clock stopped, we return every week to the same house on the same street and feel the specific comfort of finding it exactly where we left it. And there is nothing wrong with this. The need for stable reference points in an unstable world is real. The comfort of finding something familiar when everything else is changing is real. The show provides something genuine by remaining the way it has always been. But it is worth being honest about who the loop actually serves. It is not Homer. Homer, in the coma theory, is sustained by the loop. In the radiation theory, the loop is a symptom of his damage. In the collective denial theory, the loop is the consequence of choices made at the community level. In all of these readings, the loop is something that happens to Homer, something that is done to him by forces larger than himself. But the audience is one of those larger forces. We are part of what keeps Springfield frozen. We are part of what prevents the family from aging, part of what makes the reset button necessary, part of what ensures the show will never fully commit to consequences that cannot be undone by the following episode. The Simpsons will not change because we will not let it change. And perhaps on some level we know this. Perhaps that is why the emotional register that fans use when talking about the show so often sounds like the emotional register of someone talking about family. The way you talk about family when you know the relationship is complicated and imperfect and has things that need to be said that are not being said, but you return to it anyway because returning is what you do. Because the family is the thing you cannot let go of. Even when the family is frozen. Even when nothing is allowed to change. Even when the year keeps moving forward and the characters stay exactly where they always were, you go back to Evergreen Terrace. You always go back. Closing extended meditation. The dream that belongs to all of us. There is one last thing to say, and it is the thing that all the theories have been approaching from different angles without quite arriving at directly. The Simpsons is not a mystery to be solved. It is a feeling to be inhabited. Every theory we have explored tonight, every thread we have pulled, every piece of evidence we have assembled, has been pointing toward a single emotional truth. That something in this show touches a nerve in its audience that very few pieces of entertainment have ever reached. The radiation theory says Springfield is poisoned, but Springfield's people love each other anyway. The coma theory says Homer is dreaming, but the dream he chose to have is his family, intact, forever. The shooting mystery says the official answer may be wrong, but the family stayed together regardless of what the truth was. The Burns immortality framework says a man has been kept alive for over a century by the machinery of unchecked wealth, but the town around him has its own forms of resilience that his wealth cannot fully touch. The Tamzarian episode says Springfield chose a lie, but the lie it chose was community. It chose the bonds it had built with a man who had been its neighbor for 20 years, over the abstract truth of who he had been born as. Maggie's silence says the most intelligent person in the family is also the most hidden one, but she is hiding in order to protect, not to abandon. She is waiting for a moment to use what she has, not accumulating it for its own sake. Mona's exile says resistance has costs. But Mona resisted anyway, and her son inherited not just the damage but also something of the moral clarity that made her resist in the first place. The predictions say the show has been reading America for 36 years. But the reading has always been in service of something larger than accuracy. It has been in service of helping the audience see itself. And the floating timeline says nobody ages. But the show is also, in its 36th year, still capable of producing moments of genuine emotion. Still capable of making you feel the specific weight of Homer reaching for something he cannot quite hold. Still capable of making Lisa's isolation feel real and important. Still capable of making the couch and the television and the familiar opening notes of the theme song feel like coming home. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen through inertia. That happens because somewhere underneath the gags and the callbacks and the 36 years of accumulated continuity, the show is still telling the truth about something. About family. About the specific, imperfect love that holds people together despite everything. About the gap between who we are and who we meant to be. About the weight of the past on the present. About the ways that systems of power damage ordinary people without the ordinary people ever quite understanding the source of the damage. About the stubborn, unreasonable, irrational insistence of ordinary people on loving each other anyway, on building a life out of whatever materials are available. On going home at 5:30 and sitting on the couch and watching television and being, in some imperfect and real way, together. That is the show. That is what all the theories are circling around. A family in a house in a town that does not quite exist, loving each other in ways that are not quite adequate, in a world that is not quite fair, for longer than any of them quite knows how to sustain. And we keep watching, because we know this story. We have always known this story. It is our story. It has always been our story. Springfield is wherever you are watching from. The loop is the one you are already inside. The family on the couch is yours. And the show will be there when you wake up. It always is. Sleep well wherever you are. Bonus section. The side characters and what they reveal about Springfield's hidden structure. We have spent most of tonight focused on the Simpson family and on Burns, because they are where the largest threads run. But Springfield is not just a family and a billionaire. It is a community. And the side characters of that community carry evidence of their own. Evidence that supports and deepens every theory we have explored if you know where to look and what to look for. Let us start with Chief Clancy Wiggum. Wiggum is the chief of police in Springfield. He is also, by any objective measure, one of the most catastrophically incompetent law enforcement officials ever depicted in American television. He misses obvious evidence. He pursues the wrong suspects. He allows crimes to occur in his immediate presence and responds with confusion rather than action. He is bribed routinely, casually, almost reflexively, by anyone who wants something from the Springfield Police Department and has a modest amount of money to spend. Eday Show plays all of this as comedy. Wiggum is a buffoon. His incompetence is funny. The jokes around him land because they are built on a recognizable satirical template. The useless authority figure, the corrupt institution that cannot perform its stated function. But under the radiation theory, Wiggum's incompetence is not a personality trait, it is a symptom. Consider his history. The show establishes that Wiggum was at Burns's biological weapons facility in 1969 when Mona Simpson's group conducted their raid. He was the security guard at the facility. He was exposed to whatever was being developed there. And the show tells us that the antibiotic bomb Mona's group deployed accidentally cured his asthma. This is played as a comedy beat. The raid on the germ warfare lab accidentally healed the security guard's respiratory condition. It is absurd and funny, and the show moves on from it immediately. But if the biological agents at that facility had effects beyond the one the antibiotic bomb counteracted, if there were other things in that lab that were already in Wiggum's system when the raid happened, then his subsequent decades of cognitive impairment take on a different character. He was not just the security guard at a biological weapons lab. He was a man who spent time in a facility developing pathogens, working in proximity to materials whose effects on human biology were designed to be severe. Whatever his exposure in 1969 did to his neurology, whatever combination of the lab's materials and the antibiotic bomb's counteraction produced in his specific biology, the result is a man whose cognitive function has been impaired in a way that has lasted for decades. Springfield's law enforcement is compromised at the leadership level by the same forces of environmental and biological contamination that compromise the rest of the town. This means that the institution specifically responsible for investigating the things going wrong in Springfield, for pursuing accountability for the people causing harm, is run by someone whose ability to pursue that accountability has been damaged by exposure to the harm he is supposed to investigate. Burns did not need to bribe Wiggum into incompetence, though the show establishes that he has done so anyway, as additional insurance. Wiggum's fundamental incapacity was established before Burns ever needed to actively manage it. The contamination produced the incompetence that makes the contamination invisible. Now, consider Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon. Apu runs the Quick E-Mart, Springfield's convenience store. He is a highly educated man, holding a doctorate and having been, at various points in his history, capable of sophisticated work in fields far beyond the management of a convenience store. He knows this. He is aware that his capabilities exceed his employment. And yet he stays in Springfield. He stays at the Quick E-Mart. He raises a family in the contaminated environment, producing children who will grow up drinking the same water and breathing the same air and living in the shadow of the same cooling towers as everyone else. The show offers various explanations for this: his immigration status, his sense of community, his love for the specific absurdity of Springfield and its residents. All of these are real within the show's narrative. But the radiation theory adds another layer. Apu has been in Springfield long enough that the contamination has become part of his baseline. The cognitive effects of long-term exposure do not feel like damage to the people experiencing them because the baseline shifts gradually. The slightly blunted capacity for pattern recognition, the slightly reduced ability to maintain outrage at obvious injustice, the slightly increased comfort with things that should be uncomfortable, these changes accumulate so slowly that the person experiencing them adapts to each stage before the next stage begins. Apu does not feel trapped in Springfield. He feels at home in Springfield. And the two things, feeling trapped and feeling at home, are not as different as they might appear when the mechanism that makes you feel at home is also the mechanism that prevents you from fully perceiving the reasons you should leave. Then there is Dr. Nick Riviera. Dr. Nick is Springfield's other doctor, the one people go to when they cannot afford Dr. Hibbert, or when they need something done that a more reputable physician would refuse. He is catastrophically unqualified. He has performed procedures that medical science does not recognize. He has given advice that has actively harmed patients. He operates outside the bounds of any recognizable standard of medical care. And he is in Springfield. He has been in Springfield for decades. He has an office. He has patients. He continues to practice. The show plays this as a joke about the healthcare system and about the dangers of unregulated medicine. But under the radiation theory, Dr. Nick represents something specific: the corruption of the medical infrastructure that would otherwise be the most likely mechanism for identifying and addressing the health effects of Springfield's contamination. If Springfield had a functional, rigorous, properly regulated medical community, the patterns of illness and biological abnormality in the population would eventually become visible in health data. A doctor who was paying attention, who was maintaining proper records, who was comparing notes with colleagues and looking for patterns across the patient population, would eventually notice that Springfield's residents have unusual rates of certain conditions, unusual biological characteristics, unusual physiological responses to standard treatments. Dr. Nick would not notice any of this. Dr. Nick barely notices whether his patients are alive when he is done with them. His presence in the Springfield medical ecosystem, alongside whatever compromising influence Burns exercises over the more reputable physicians in town, ensures that the medical community is not a source of accountability for what the plant is doing to the population. The incompetent doctor who charges low rates and asks no questions is, in this reading, another mechanism of the same system that keeps the contamination invisible. Burns does not need the entire medical community under his control. He just needs the weakest links to be weak enough that the overall system cannot function as a mechanism of accountability. Dr. Nick is not an accident. He is a feature. And then there is Professor Frink. Professor Frink is Springfield's scientist. He has the technical knowledge to analyze the contamination, to trace it to its source, to document the health effects, to produce the kind of rigorous scientific evidence that would be difficult for even Burns's institutional influence to completely suppress. Frink has the tools to understand what is happening to Springfield. And Frink is consistently ineffective. His inventions malfunction, his analyses are ignored, his warnings are dismissed. He has the knowledge but not the social capital to make that knowledge matter. He is the person in the room who understands what everyone else is missing, and he has spent decades understanding it without that understanding producing any change. This is the show's most honest depiction of the limits of expertise in a system optimized for a different outcome. Frink can tell you exactly what is in the water. He can show you the radiation readings. He can produce the data that proves the contamination is real and the effects are measurable. None of that matters if the people who would need to act on the data have reasons, economic and cognitive and social, not to act on it. Knowledge without power is not the same thing as knowledge. And in Springfield, the person with the relevant knowledge does not have the power to make it matter. The person with the power has no interest in the knowledge becoming public. And the people who would need to demand accountability from the powerful have had their capacity for sustained outrage compromised by the very contamination they would need to be outraged about. Frink keeps doing the science. The science keeps going nowhere. And Springfield keeps running on the power generated by the cracked reactor, and the water keeps flowing through the contaminated pipes, and the fish keep being pulled from the river with their extra eyes. Finally, let us talk about Bart's teacher, Mrs. Krabappel, and what she represents in the context of Springfield's denial infrastructure. Mrs. Krabappel knows Springfield Elementary is chronically underfunded, chronically mismanaged, chronically failing its students. She has been teaching at this school for decades. She has watched the oil well be stolen from beneath the school. She has watched program after program be eliminated due to lack of funding. She has watched her students receive an education that is, by any reasonable assessment, inadequate for what the world outside Springfield will require of them. And she keeps coming back every fall. She keeps standing at the front of the classroom. She keeps doing the job with whatever diminished resources the job provides, in whatever state of cynical exhaustion the job has produced in her. The show depicts her cynicism as a character trait, as something funny and familiar about a specific type of burned-out educator, but it is also a form of adaptation. Mrs. Krabappel has adapted to the conditions of Springfield Elementary in the same way that the plants in the power plant's shadow have adapted to the radiation, by adjusting to the baseline and continuing to function in whatever modified form the conditions allow. She is not ineffective because she does not care. She is ineffective because the system she operates within has been structured to ensure that the people inside it cannot produce the outcomes the people inside it are trying to produce. Every side character in Springfield is a variation on this theme. A person with real capabilities, real feelings, real desires for their own life and for the life of their community, operating within a system that converts those capabilities and feelings and desires into something that sustains the status quo rather than challenging it. Springfield is not a town of fools. It is a town of people whose intelligence and compassion and desire for better have been channeled by the specific structure of the systems they live inside, into forms that cannot threaten the thing at the center. The thing at the center being, always, the plant, and the man who owns it, and the invisible contamination spreading outward from its cracked towers into the water and the air, and the biology and the cognition of everyone who has ever called Springfield home. That is Springfield, in all its comedy and tragedy and impossible resilience and terrible stasis. That is the show, and that is why, 36 years later, we are still here, still watching, still finding new threads to pull, still asking the questions that the characters cannot ask because the characters are inside the thing we are looking at from outside. We see it because we are not in Springfield, but we keep going back, because Springfield is where the family is, and the family, imperfect and complicated and damaged and loving and permanent, is what we came for. It is what we always came for. It is what we will always come back for. Good night, Springfield. Good night. End. Final section. The questions the show will never answer and why that is the point. Every long-running story eventually reaches a moment where the audience wants resolution, where the threads that have been running for years feel like they should converge, where the questions that have accumulated across seasons feel like they deserve answers, where the story should, in some meaningful sense, arrive somewhere. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years and it has not arrived anywhere. Not because it has been drifting. The show has been moving, within the specific kind of motion that a floating timeline permits, sideways, laterally, exploring new configurations of the same essential elements, finding new angles on the same essential questions. But it has not moved forward. It has not resolved. It has not answered. And the theories we have explored tonight are, in a sense, the audience's attempt to manufacture the resolution the show will not provide. The radiation theory answers why the characters look the way they do. The coma theory answers why nobody ages and why the plot keeps escalating. The Tamsarian theory answers why Springfield resets. The Burns immortality theory answers how one man can exist across more than a century of American history. Each theory is an answer to a question the show poses but declines to resolve. But here is the thing about why the show declines. The questions The Simpsons poses are not the kind of questions that have answers. They are the kind of questions that are more useful unresolved than resolved. Why does nobody age? Because aging means ending. And endings, in the context of this particular story, would require confronting what it means that the American family the show has spent 36 years depicting is constitutionally fragile. That Homer's love for his family, however real and however consistent, has not been enough to protect that family from the systems bearing down on it. That Marge's patience has not been enough to create the stability she keeps trying to build. That Bart's rebellion has not produced any meaningful change in the structures he is rebelling against. That Lisa's intelligence and moral seriousness have not moved Springfield in any measurable direction toward the better world she keeps trying to articulate. If the story ended, if the timeline started moving again, the ending would have to reckon with all of this, with the gap between what the family tried to be and what the systems around it allowed them to be, with the distance between Homer's love and Homer's capacity to express that love in ways that actually help the people he loves, with the cost that Marge has paid for her patience, with what Lisa's idealism has or has not been able to accomplish against the weight of a community that prefers things as they are. The floating timeline prevents this reckoning, and perhaps the floating timeline is an act of mercy toward characters who have been carrying this weight for 36 years. The show does not answer its questions because answering them would require the show to pronounce on things that the show, wisely, understands are not for it to pronounce on. Whether the love is enough, whether the effort was worth the cost, whether the family came out of it intact in any way that matters, whether Springfield, for all its contamination and denial and institutional corruption, produced more than it damaged. These are the questions at the center of every family's experience. Not just The Simpsons. Every family that has ever tried to stay together under conditions that made staying together difficult. Every family in which love was real and also insufficient. Every family in which the systems bearing down from outside did real harm and the family survived anyway, imperfectly, with scars, with losses, with the complicated mixed record that real survival always produces. The Simpsons does not answer whether it was worth it because you cannot know whether it was worth it until it is over. And the show will not end. The show refuses to end, because ending would mean deciding, and the show has been wise enough for 36 years to understand that deciding is not its place. It can show you, it can accumulate evidence, it can lay out, across hundreds of episodes and dozens of theories, and the long, slow accumulation of detail that this video has been tracing, everything that Springfield is and everything it is not, everything the family has done and everything that has been done to them, everything Burns has taken, and everything the contamination has produced, and everything the denial has enabled, and everything the loop has preserved. But it will not tell you what it means. Because that is your job. That has always been your job. The show gives you Springfield. The show gives you the family. The show gives you the questions. What you do with the questions is up to you. What you decide the answers mean about your own family, your own town, your own version of the systems bearing down from outside, your own experience of the gap between love and its adequacy, your own relationship to the things you choose to forget and the things you can never quite let go of. That is the conversation the show has been having with you for 36 years. Not the conversation about who shot Burns or whether Homer is in a coma or what the radiation has done to Springfield's fish. Those are the vessels for the conversation. The conversation itself is about something else. It is about whether ordinary love, imperfect and sometimes inadequate and always trying, is enough to hold a family together against everything that tries to pull families apart. The show does not answer this, because the answer is different for everyone watching. And the show is wise enough to know that Springfield is wherever you are. The loop is yours. The questions are yours. The family on the couch, frozen in the amber of a floating timeline, waiting for you to come home on Sunday night and find them exactly where you left them. They will be there. They will always be there, because you need them to be. And that is the only answer the show has ever needed to give. Thank you. Sleep well. Subscribe if this kept you company. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is there, because Springfield exists in all places and all times. And so, tonight, do you. A note on the evidence and the experience of watching Springfield, knowing what you know. After everything we have been through tonight, it is worth spending a few minutes thinking about what it actually feels like to go back and watch the show once these theories have settled into your thinking. Because something does change. Not for everyone. Some people watch the episode with Homer eating a donut in the control room, and they see a funny gag about workplace laziness, and they laugh and move on. That response is real. That laugh is valid. The show is, at its surface level, extremely funny, and the surface level is a genuinely good place to live. But for some people, after a certain amount of time spent in the theories, the surface level starts to feel thin, translucent. You can see through it, and what you see through it is what we have been talking about. You watch Homer sleep at the console, and you think about 342 violations, and the cracked cooling tower, and the water supply downstream of the facility. You watch the residents of Springfield walk past the plant every day on their way to their other lives, and you think about what is accumulating in their biology, slowly, over decades, in ways none of them can see or measure or trace. You watch Burns look out of his office window at the town he owns, and you think about the deliberateness behind the whole arrangement. The architectural precision with which one very old, very intelligent, very ruthless man has organized a community's dependency on him. You watch Ned Flanders forgive Homer one more time, and you think about the conditioning and the buried rage and the God who talks to Homer and will not talk to Ned. You watch Maggie watching the family and you wonder what she is calculating. You watch the town forget a catastrophe and you see the vote being taken, even when the episode never shows you the vote. The show becomes layered. It does not become less funny. Somehow, it becomes funnier in some places, because the comedy lands differently when you understand the darkness underneath it. The joke about Homer's IQ is funnier and sadder when you know about the crayon, and what the crayon might have been, and what Homer would have been without it. The joke about Wiggum missing obvious evidence is funnier and darker when you consider the biological legacy of his time at the facility in 1969. And the emotional moments hit harder. The way they tend to hit harder when you understand context. The scene where Homer finds his mother beside a headstone that belongs to Walt Whitman, a scene that was moving on first viewing, becomes something else once you understand what Burns did to put her there. The weight of that reunion is not just a weight of time and separation. It is the weight of deliberate, engineered separation, of a grudge held for 27 years by a man with the resources to make a grudge last that long. The scene where Homer has the crayon removed and becomes, briefly, the person he could have been, hits differently once you understand that the person he could have been was taken from him before he was old enough to fight for it. The sadness is not just Homer's sadness at discovering the person he is not. It is the sadness of understanding what he was not permitted to be, and who permitted it, and the fact that the person who permitted it is still signing Homer's paycheck. The show was always about these things. It has been about them from the beginning. The comedy was never the point of the comedy. The comedy was the vehicle, the thing the comedy was carrying, the thing it has been delivering into the cultural consciousness of its audience for 36 years, is a story about power and love and damage and survival and the specific, complicated, impossible resilience of ordinary people trying to hold their ordinary lives together against everything. The theories do not change the show. They reveal what was already there. And what was already there, once you can see it, is something remarkable. A story told with more care, more consistency, more structural intelligence, and more genuine feeling than the surface of it suggests. A story that has been earning its emotional moments across hundreds of episodes of setup, building the context that makes the payoff land. A story that is funnier and sadder and more true than it has any right to be, given that it is, officially, a cartoon about a yellow family in a fictional town. Springfield is fictional, but the things Springfield is about are not. The contamination is real. The corporate malfeasance that produces it is real. The community denial that allows it to persist is real. The political and economic dependencies that make accountability difficult are real. The damage that chronic exposure to industrial harm does to individuals and communities and across generations is real. Homer Simpson is not a real person. But there are real people whose lives follow the shape of Homer's, shaped by childhood losses they did not understand, working for institutions that exploit their specific vulnerabilities, too damaged by the systems they are inside to fully perceive the damage being done. Burns is not a real person, but the structural position Burns occupies, the position of a person whose wealth is large enough and deep enough and old enough that it has become effectively immune to normal mechanisms of accountability, is occupied by real people in the real world. Springfield does not exist on any map, but the dynamic Springfield illustrates, the dynamic of a community organized around a contaminating facility that it cannot afford to challenge, is a dynamic that exists in real places with real names and real residents and real health consequences that accumulate across real generations. The show has been telling you about these real things through the filter of satire and animation and a floating timeline and a family with yellow skin for 36 years. Not to make you despair, not to tell you that nothing can be done and power always wins and the loop is unbreakable, but because stories are how we process the things that are too large and too painful to process directly, because satire makes bearable the things that, stated plainly, are almost unbearable, because comedy, real comedy, the kind that cuts through to something true, is one of the few tools that can carry that kind of weight without collapsing under it. The Simpsons has been carrying this weight for 36 years. It has not collapsed. It is still carrying it. That, more than any individual theory, more than any specific piece of evidence, is the thing that stays with you after you close the browser and turn the lights down and let the night settle around you. The show is still here, still running, still telling the same story in new configurations, finding new angles on the same essential human questions, refusing to arrive anywhere because arriving would mean the story was done. And the story is not done. It will not be done until we stop needing it. And we have not stopped needing it. 36 years, 788 episodes, and we are still here, still watching, still finding new threads to pull, still going home to Evergreen Terrace, where the family is always there, where the light in the kitchen window is always on, where Homer is always about to come through the door, where Marge is always listening for the sound of his car in the driveway, where Bart is somewhere in the house, probably causing trouble, and Lisa is in her room with the saxophone, and Maggie is in the high chair watching everything with those enormous eyes, saying nothing, understanding everything, waiting for whatever she is waiting for. The family is there. The family is always there. Sleep well.